Chapter 1. The Charming Devil's Arrival. Chicago, 1886. The autumn wind that swept through Chicago in 1886 carried with it more than the promise of a harsh winter. It carried the scent of ambition, greed, and something far more sinister. As horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestone streets and the smoke from 1,000 chimneys darkened the sky, a train from New Hampshire pulled into Union Station, disgorging its passengers into the bustling chaos of America's fastest-growing city. Among those passengers stepped a man who would forever alter the definition of evil in America. He was unremarkable in appearance, average height, well-groomed dark hair, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. But there was something magnetic about him, a charm that drew people like moths to a flame, unaware that this particular flame would consume them entirely. Herman Webster Mudgett had died somewhere between New Hampshire and Illinois. In his place stood Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, a name chosen with deliberate care to honour the fictional detective Sherlock Holmes. The irony was delicious, taking the name of literature's greatest solver of mysteries while planning to become its greatest creator of them. The real Herman Mudgett had left behind a young wife, Clara, and their infant son in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. He had abandoned them not out of desperation or poverty, but out of something far more chilling: boredom. The conventional life of a small-town doctor held no appeal for a man whose true passion lay in exploring the darkest corners of human mortality. Even as a child, Herman had shown disturbing fascinations. He had tortured animals with scientific precision, performed crude dissections on neighbourhood pets, and once forced a terrified classmate to touch a human skeleton in the local doctor's office. Delighting in the boy's screams of terror, medical school had only refined these appetites. While other students struggled with cadaver work, Herman thrived. He spent hours after class in the anatomy lab, exploring corpses with an intimacy that disturbed even his professors. He had been caught more than once in compromising positions with the dead, but his brilliant mind and natural charm had deflected serious consequences. He graduated with honours, but his classmates whispered that something was fundamentally wrong with Herman Mudgett. Now, as Dr. H. Holmes, he walked the streets of Chicago with purpose. The city was experiencing unprecedented growth, doubling in population every decade as immigrants and fortune-seekers flooded in from across America and Europe. It was a place where a man could reinvent himself completely, where questions about one's past were considered impolite, and where opportunity beckoned from every corner. Holmes had chosen Chicago carefully. He had heard rumours that the city would host a great World's Fair, an exposition that would bring millions of visitors and unprecedented wealth. More importantly, it would bring countless strangers, people who wouldn't be missed immediately, people whose disappearances could be explained away as simple departures for other opportunities. His first order of business was securing employment that would provide both income and access to the chemicals and equipment his future endeavours would require. He found both at E.S. Holton's pharmacy, located at the corner of 63rd and Wallace Street in the Inglewood neighbourhood. The area was perfect, close enough to downtown to attract visitors, but far enough out to maintain a certain privacy. Elizabeth Holton, the elderly widow who owned the pharmacy, was immediately charmed by the handsome young doctor who applied for the position. Holmes spun a tale of wanting to escape the constraints of small-town practice to help the urban poor, his eyes twinkling with what appeared to be genuine compassion. Within a week, he was not only employed but had become Mrs. Holton's most trusted confidant. Holmes threw himself into his work with an enthusiasm that impressed both his employer and the neighbourhood customers. He was knowledgeable about medicines, gentle with children, and possessed an uncanny ability to remember every customer's name and personal details. Women in particular found him irresistible. He would lean across the counter, his blue eyes focused intently on their faces as they described their ailments, making each feel as though she were the most important person in the world. But behind this charming facade, Holmes was studying. He memorized the neighborhood's rhythms, identified which houses stood empty during the day, and noted which residents traveled frequently. He catalogued the pharmacy's inventory of poisons and acids, mentally calculating which combinations would be most effective and least detectable. Most importantly, he began to envision something grand, a structure that would allow him to indulge his darkest appetites on an unprecedented scale. Within months of his arrival, Mrs. Holton's health began to mysteriously decline. She complained of constant fatigue, digestive issues, and strange pains that seemed to migrate throughout her body. Holmes, ever the concerned employee, took on more responsibilities, eventually managing the pharmacy's books and handling all supplier relationships. He was solicitous of her condition, often preparing special tonics to help with her symptoms. By spring of 1887, Elizabeth Holton was dead. The cause was listed as heart failure, though neighbours whispered about how quickly her health had deteriorated once the handsome young doctor had arrived. Holmes, devastated by the loss of his dear friend, handled all funeral arrangements with touching efficiency. He also handled the reading of her will, which, surprisingly, left the pharmacy and the empty lot behind it entirely to her faithful employee, Dr. H. Holmes. As the funeral procession wound its way through Inglewood streets, Holmes stood graveside with appropriately mournful expression, offering comfort to Mrs. Holton's few remaining relatives. But beneath his mask of grief, his mind was racing with possibilities. The lot behind the pharmacy was large enough for his vision, a building that would serve multiple purposes, generate income, and provide him with the perfect hunting ground. That evening, alone in the pharmacy, Holmes stood at the rear window looking out at the empty lot that was now his. The gas lamps along Wallace Street cast long shadows across the vacant ground, and in those shadows he could already see the outline of his masterpiece. It would be a hotel, he decided, a place where travellers could find comfortable accommodations, but it would be so much more than that. He pulled out a piece of paper and began to sketch. 3 stories, he thought. The ground floor would house legitimate businesses to maintain appearances and generate income. The upper floors would contain guest rooms, but these would be special rooms, rooms designed with his particular needs in mind, and beneath it all, a basement that would serve purposes too dark to commit to paper. As he drew, Holmes felt a familiar excitement building in his chest. It was the same feeling he had experienced as a child when he had cornered a stray cat, the same rush he had felt in medical school when he first held a human heart in his hands. But this would be different. This would be systematic, scientific, and on a scale that would dwarf anything attempted before. The great Chicago World's Fair was still years away, but Holmes could wait. He was a patient man, and patience was required for truly great works. He would build his castle, perfect his methods, and prepare for the greatest hunting season in human history. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending newspapers skittering down the deserted street. Somewhere in the distance a dog howled mournfully, as if sensing that something fundamentally evil had taken root in Inglewood. Holmes smiled at the sound. Even nature, it seemed, recognized the presence of a superior predator. The charming Dr. H. Holmes had arrived in Chicago, and the city would never be the same. Chapter 2. The Castle's Foundation, 1887 or 1888. The sound of hammers rang through the Englewood neighbourhood from dawn until dusk, a metallic symphony that announced the birth of something unprecedented in American architecture. Local residents, initially pleased to see the empty lot behind Holton's pharmacy being developed, began to whisper among themselves about the peculiar nature of the construction and the even more peculiar behaviour of its architect. Dr. H. Holmes stood in the centre of what would become his kingdom, blueprint in hand, directing workers with the precision of a military commander. But these weren't ordinary building plans, and Holmes was no ordinary architect. The blueprints he carried were incomplete by design, showing only fragments of rooms, partial hallway layouts, and vague structural details. No single worker would ever see the complete vision. Holmes had learned from the Gothic novels he devoured that true evil required absolute secrecy. The building permit applications filed with the city described a modest 3-story commercial and residential structure. What rose from the foundation was anything but modest. Holmes had invested every penny of his inheritance from Mrs. Holton's estate, plus substantial loans he had no intention of repaying, into creating his masterpiece. The structure stretched 162 feet along Wallace Street and extended 50 feet deep into the lot, its brick facade designed to project respectability and prosperity. But it was what lay behind that facade that revealed Holmes's true genius for malevolence. The construction process itself became Holmes's first systematic exercise in manipulation and murder. He hired workers in small teams, never allowing any group to work on the same section for more than a few weeks. When pressed for reasons, He explained that he was experimenting with different construction techniques and wanted fresh perspectives on each phase. The real reason was far more sinister. He couldn't afford to let anyone understand the building's true purpose. Thomas Owens, a carpenter from County Cork, was the first to voice suspicions. He had been hired to install what Holmes described as ventilation systems in several second-floor rooms. But the pipes Owens was asked to install didn't lead outside. They led to a central control valve in what Holmes claimed would be his private office. When Owens questioned the design, pointing out that the system seemed designed to pump gas into rooms rather than provide fresh air, Holmes's demeanour changed instantly. The transformation was subtle, but terrifying. The jovial, encouraging employer vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. Holmes's blue eyes seemed to darken as he stared at Owens, and when he spoke, his voice carried an edge that made the Irishman's blood run cold. "Mr. Owens," Holmes said quietly, "I hired you for your carpentry skills, not your engineering opinions. If you're uncomfortable with the work, perhaps you'd be happier seeking employment elsewhere." Owens should have left that day. And instead, the promise of steady wages and Holmes's return to his charming demeanour the following morning convinced him to stay. It was a decision that would cost him his life. 3 weeks later, Owens was found dead in the building's partially completed basement, apparently the victim of a construction accident. A beam had fallen, crushing his skull, though several workers privately noted that the beam had been securely fastened just hours before. Holmes was devastated by the loss, paying for Owens' funeral and expressing deep regret to his widow. But that night, alone in the building, he stood over the blood-stained concrete where Owens had died and felt only satisfaction. The Irishman had seen too much, asked too many questions. His death served multiple purposes. It eliminated a potential problem, provided Holmes with his first kill in the building that would become synonymous with murder, and sent a clear message to other workers that curiosity was dangerous. As construction continued through 1887 and into 1888, more workers met unfortunate ends. Giuseppe Torino, an Italian plasterer, fell down an elevator shaft that Holmes insisted didn't need safety railings. Heinrich Weber, a German plumber who questioned why water pipes in several rooms led nowhere, was found dead of apparent gas poisoning in one of the basement chambers. Each death was ruled accidental, each funeral was attended by the grief-stricken Dr. Holmes, and each disappearance allowed Holmes to refine his killing methods. The building that emerged from this foundation of murder was a testament to architectural malevolence. The ground floor housed legitimate businesses, Holmes's expanded pharmacy, a restaurant, and several retail shops that would provide both income and cover for the activities above. But it was the upper floors that revealed Holmes's true artistry. The second floor contained 35 rooms, but these weren't ordinary hotel accommodations. Holmes had designed a maze of corridors that defied logic, with hallways that led nowhere, staircases that stopped at blank walls, and doors that opened onto empty air. Guests checking in would be assigned rooms seemingly at random, but Holmes's system had a twisted logic. He could control exactly where people went, and ensure they could never find their way out without his guidance. Many rooms were equipped with gas pipes connected to Holmes's central control system. With the turn of a valve in his office, he could flood any room with deadly gas, listening through specially installed speaking tubes as his victims slowly succumbed. Other rooms featured ingenious trapdoors that could drop unsuspecting guests into sealed chambers below, where they would slowly suffocate while Holmes observed through hidden peepholes. The most diabolical rooms were soundproofed with layers of brick and asbestos, allowing Holmes to conduct extended torture sessions without disturbing other guests. These chambers were equipped with medieval implements he had acquired from antique dealers, as well as modern surgical tools that allowed him to explore the human body's capacity for pain with scientific precision. The third floor served as Holmes' private domain and contained his most specialized equipment. Here he had constructed a complete surgical suite where he could perform dissections and prepare bodies for disposal. Adjacent chambers housed his growing collection of anatomical specimens, including several complete skeletons that he planned to sell to medical schools for substantial profit. But it was the basement that represented Holmes's masterpiece of evil engineering. Accessible only through hidden passages and known only to Holmes himself, the basement contained the apparatus necessary for large-scale body disposal. Acid vats large enough to dissolve human remains completely lined one wall, while quicklime pits provided an alternative method for accelerating decomposition. A custom-built crematorium, disguised as a heating system for the building above, could reduce a human body to ash in less than 3 hours. Most ingenious of all was Holmes' corpse processing facility. Using skills learned in medical school, he could efficiently strip flesh from bones, clean inarticulate skeletons, and preserve organs in formaldehyde solutions. The medical schools of Chicago paid handsomely for high-quality anatomical specimens, and Holmes intended to corner this market using raw materials acquired through his hotel operations. By the spring of 1888, Holmes's murder castle was nearing completion. The final touches included the installation of an elaborate alarm system that would alert him instantly if anyone attempted to leave their room without permission, and a series of hidden passages that allowed him to move throughout the building unseen by guests or employees. Standing in his third-floor office as the sun set over Chicago, Holmes surveyed his domain with deep satisfaction. The building had cost him everything he owned, and much that he didn't, but it was worth every penny and every life it had claimed during construction. Here, he could indulge his darkest appetites while maintaining the facade of a successful businessman. Here he could explore the boundaries of human suffering while generating substantial profits from his victims' remains. The Chicago World's Fair was still 5 years away, but Holmes was a patient predator. He would spend those years perfecting his methods, testing his equipment, and preparing for the greatest harvest of human prey in history. The foundation had been laid, both literally and figuratively, for an enterprise that would redefine the very concept of systematic murder. As gas lamps flickered to life throughout Englewood, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets, Holmes's building stood like a dark monument to human evil. Neighbours had grown accustomed to the strange sounds that emanated from within, the occasional scream quickly muffled, the grinding of machinery at odd hours, the acrid smells that seemed to seep from its walls. But they attributed these disturbances to the eccentricities of their charming neighbour, Dr. Holmes, who worked so tirelessly to help the less fortunate. After all, what harm could come from such a kind and generous man? Holmes smiled at their naivety. The foundation of his empire had been laid in blood and deception, and soon the real work would begin. Chapter 3. Rooms of No Return. 1889. The year 1889 marked the completion of Holmes's architectural abomination and the beginning of what he privately called his experimental phase. As spring rain drummed against the windows of his third-floor office, Holmes stood before a detailed schematic of his building, a document that existed nowhere else and would be destroyed before anyone else could see it. Each room was labelled not with numbers, but with categories that reflected their intended purpose in his grand design of systematic murder. Room 2A. The suffocation chamber, a seemingly normal guest room with one crucial modification. Hidden beneath the floorboards lay an airtight seal that could be activated by removing a single pin from Holmes's office. Once sealed, the room's occupant would have approximately 45 minutes of air before unconsciousness set in, and another 15 minutes before death. Holmes had calculated these times precisely using stray cats as test subjects, though he longed to verify his calculations with human subjects. Room 2F. The gas laboratory, equipped with pipes that could deliver everything from illuminating gas for a quick death to experimental chemical combinations Holmes had developed during his medical studies. The speaking tube that connected this room to his office allowed him to monitor his victims' final moments, taking careful notes on the effectiveness of different compounds and dosages. Room 3C, the dissection theatre, soundproofed and equipped with surgical instruments, this chamber would serve as both torture room and anatomy laboratory. The slanted floor, disguised as architectural quirk, was actually designed to drain blood efficiently into hidden channels that led to the basement disposal system. But before Holmes could fully utilize his architectural masterpiece, he needed test subjects, individuals whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger investigations. Chicago's streets provided no shortage of candidates. His first victim was Patrick O'Malley, an Irish labourer who had injured his back working on the railroad and sought treatment at Holmes's pharmacy. O'Malley was exactly what Holmes needed, a man with no family in the city, few friends, and a transient lifestyle that made sudden disappearances seem natural. When Holmes offered O'Malley a job helping with building maintenance in exchange for room and board, the grateful Irishman accepted immediately. Holmes assigned O'Malley to room 2A, explaining that the accommodations were modest but comfortable. He waited 3 days, allowing O'Malley to establish a routine and giving himself time to study his victim's habits. Then, on a fog-shrouded Thursday evening, Holmes activated the room's sealing mechanism while O'Malley slept. The Irishman's death was everything Holmes had hoped for and more. Through the speaking tube, he listened to O'Malley's growing panic as the man realized he was trapped. First came confused attempts to open windows that had been secretly nailed shut, then increasingly frantic pounding on a door that Holmes had designed to be impregnable from the inside. The transition from anger to fear to desperation provided Holmes with data he meticulously recorded in a leather-bound journal he kept hidden behind a false panel in his office. O'Malley's final moments were particularly illuminating. As oxygen levels dropped, the Irishman's voice became slurred and confused. He began speaking to people who weren't there, calling out to his mother in County Cork and begging forgiveness for sins Holmes could only imagine. When silence finally fell after exactly 43 minutes, Holmes felt a profound satisfaction that surpassed even his most optimistic expectations. The disposal process proved equally efficient. Holmes waited until the early morning hours, then accessed the room through a hidden panel and transferred O'Malley's body to the basement via a specially constructed dumbwaiter. The corpse processing system worked flawlessly. Within 6 hours, Patrick O'Malley had been reduced to clean bones, useful organs preserved in formaldehyde, and a quantity of ash that Holmes scattered in the alley behind the building. Encouraged by this success, Holmes expanded his operations throughout the summer of 1889. Margaret Fitzgerald, a seamstress seeking affordable lodging, became the first victim of Room 2F's gas delivery system. Holmes had modified illuminating gas with chloroform, creating a compound that rendered victims unconscious before killing them. Through the speaking tube, he listened to Margaret's confused mumblings as she slowly succumbed, taking notes on the timeline and symptoms for future reference. Heinrich Zimmermann, a German immigrant who spoke little English, provided Holmes with an opportunity to test Room 3C's more hands-on capabilities. Holmes had lured Zimmermann to the building with promises of work, then overpowered him with chloroform and transported him to the soundproof chamber while unconscious. When Zimmermann awoke, he found himself strapped to a table that Holmes had acquired from a defunct veterinary college. What followed was Holmes's first extended torture session in his custom-built facility. Using surgical instruments with the precision his medical training had provided, Holmes explored the limits of human endurance while maintaining his victim in a state where useful information could be gathered. Zimmermann's death, after nearly 6 hours of systematic torment, provided Holmes with detailed knowledge of human anatomy that no textbook could match. Each murder taught Holmes valuable lessons. He learned that soundproofing was crucial. Even the most isolated rooms could transmit screams if not properly insulated. He discovered that different victims responded to torture in predictable patterns, allowing him to refine his techniques for maximum psychological impact. Most importantly, he perfected his disposal methods, eventually reducing the time from death to complete elimination of evidence to under 4 hours. By autumn, Holmes had claimed 9 victims, each death more efficient than the last. He had also established the operational procedures that would serve him throughout his career as America's first systematic serial killer. Victims were always selected from transient populations, travelers, job seekers, people whose absence wouldn't be immediately noticed. Each was isolated in specially prepared rooms where escape was impossible and screams couldn't be heard. And each death contributed to Holmes's growing understanding of human psychology under extreme duress. The basement had become a factory of death, with specialized stations for each stage of body processing. Holmes had installed pulleys and winches to handle corpses efficiently, drainage systems to manage blood and other fluids, and storage areas for the various products his victims' bodies provided. The medical schools of Chicago had come to rely on Dr. Holmes as their most dependable supplier of anatomical specimens, praising the quality of his skeletons and the excellent preservation of his organ samples. But Holmes's activities weren't limited to murder for its own sake. Each victim also provided financial opportunities, personal belongings to be sold, life insurance policies to be claimed, and identities to be assumed for various fraudulent schemes. He had become particularly skilled at forging documents and had established relationships with corrupt officials who asked no questions about irregular paperwork in exchange for appropriate compensation. The transformation of Holmes himself during this period was as remarkable as the building he inhabited. The charming country doctor who had arrived in Chicago 3 years earlier had evolved into something far more calculating and deadly. He moved through his domain with the confidence of an apex predator, every gesture and expression carefully calibrated to achieve maximum effect. Staff and visitors alike commented on his magnetic personality, never realizing they were in the presence of a creature that viewed them as nothing more than potential raw materials. Local residents had grown accustomed to the peculiarities of Holmes's establishment. Strange sounds at odd hours were attributed to the building's commercial activities. Unusual smells were explained away as chemical processes related to the pharmacy's operations. The occasional disappearance of transients was accepted as the natural consequence of Chicago's mobile population. Holmes had successfully created a zone of death in the heart of a bustling neighborhood, hidden in plain sight through careful cultivation of his public image. As winter approached and Holmes prepared for the building's first full year of operation, he reflected on what he had accomplished. His experimental phase had exceeded all expectations, providing him with both the technical knowledge and psychological confidence necessary for the challenges ahead. The World's Fair was still 4 years away, but Holmes was no longer simply preparing, he was perfecting his craft. Standing in room 3C as snow began to fall outside, Holmes cleaned his instruments with the methodical care of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Tomorrow would bring new victims, new opportunities to refine his methods, and new contributions to his ever-growing understanding of human mortality. The rooms of no return had claimed their first victims, and they hungered for many more. The true horror of Holmes' achievement wasn't simply the number of people he had killed, but the systematic scientific approach he had brought to murder. This wasn't the work of a madman acting on impulse. It was the methodical application of intelligence, education, and architectural innovation to the problem of killing efficiently and profitably. He had transformed murder from a crime of passion into an industrial process, and he was just getting started. As the gas lamps dimmed throughout his building and silence settled over the rooms where so many had drawn their final breaths, Holmes smiled with the satisfaction of an artist who had perfected his technique. The experimental phase was complete, and the real work was about to begin. Chapter 4. The World Comes to Chicago, 1890-1892. The announcement came on a crisp October morning in 1890, delivered by newsboys whose voices cracked with excitement as they hawked papers throughout Chicago's streets. Chicago wins the fair. World's Columbian Exposition coming to the Windy City. The celebration that erupted across the city was unlike anything America had ever witnessed. Brass bands played on street corners, factory whistles shrieked their approval, and thousands of citizens poured into the streets in spontaneous demonstrations of civic pride. For most Chicagoans, the news meant prestige, prosperity, and the chance to show the world that their city had recovered from the Great Fire of 1871. For H. Holmes, standing in his third-floor office with the morning paper spread before him, it meant something far more significant. The largest gathering of potential victims in human history would soon be arriving at his doorstep. Holmes had been preparing for this moment since his arrival in Chicago, but the reality exceeded even his most optimistic projections. The exposition would run for 6 months, from May through October 1893, and preliminary estimates suggested it would attract over 20 million visitors. More importantly for Holmes's purposes, these wouldn't be local residents whose disappearances would be immediately noticed. They would be strangers from across America and around the world. People whose absence might not be discovered for weeks or months after they vanished into his carefully constructed maze of death. The 3 years between the announcement and the fair's opening provided Holmes with the perfect preparation period. He expanded his building's capacity, adding more specialized killing rooms and increasing the efficiency of his basement disposal system. But most importantly, he began cultivating the public image that would make his hotel an attractive destination for the fair's visitors. Holmes threw himself into Chicago's civic preparations with apparent enthusiasm, joining committees, attending planning meetings, and volunteering for various organizational roles. His charm and apparent wealth made him a welcome addition to any group, and his medical background lent credibility to his opinions on public health matters related to the massive influx of visitors. He became particularly active in discussions about lodging accommodations, positioning himself as an expert on the hospitality industry's challenges and opportunities. During these committee meetings, Holmes gathered invaluable intelligence about the fair's expected demographics. He learned that a significant percentage of visitors would be unaccompanied women, teachers seeking cultural enrichment, young ladies pursuing employment opportunities, and widows travelling in groups for safety and companionship. These revelations shaped his marketing strategy and his architectural modifications. The building underwent subtle but significant changes during this period. Holmes added several family suites designed to accommodate travelling parties, though these rooms featured his signature modifications: gas pipes, hidden exits, and soundproofing that would prevent screams from reaching adjacent accommodations. He also constructed what he advertised as ladies' safety rooms, chambers equipped with additional locks and security features that were actually designed to prevent escape once the doors were sealed from outside. Holmes's most ambitious addition was a complete beauty salon and spa facility on the second floor, staffed by young women he recruited with promises of excellent wages and profit-sharing opportunities. The salon served multiple purposes. It attracted female guests who might otherwise stay elsewhere, provided Holmes with a steady supply of potential victims from among his employees, and created a legitimate business that generated substantial revenue to fund his other activities. The staff Holmes assembled for his expanding operation were chosen with the same careful calculation he applied to everything else. He sought out individuals who were isolated from family, desperate for employment, or possessed of secrets that made them unlikely to seek help from authorities. Many were immigrants whose limited English and lack of local connections made them perfect for his purposes. Julia Smythe was perhaps his most valuable acquisition during this period, a beautiful blonde widow from Davenport, Iowa. Julia had arrived in Chicago seeking work to support herself and her 8-year-old daughter, Pearl. Holmes hired her as manager of his jewelry store on the building's ground floor, and within weeks had seduced her into becoming both his business partner and his mistress. Julia's intelligence and charm made her an excellent front for Holmes's operations, while her desperate circumstances ensured her loyalty and silence. What Julia didn't realize was that Holmes viewed both her and her daughter as long-term investments rather than permanent arrangements. Pearl, with her innocent blonde curls and trusting nature, represented the ultimate challenge for Holmes's developing techniques. Murdering a child would require different methods and would provide unique psychological satisfaction. But he was patient, allowing his relationship with Julia to develop naturally while planning both their eventual destruction. As 1892 progressed, and the fair's opening approached, Holmes's building became a hive of activity. He hired additional staff, installed new equipment, and conducted what he euphemistically called systems testing, using transient victims whose disappearances wouldn't interrupt his preparations. The basement processing facility reached peak efficiency during this period, handling up to 3 bodies simultaneously, while maintaining the quality standards that had made Holmes' anatomical specimens highly sought after by medical institutions. The psychological transformation in Holmes during this period was remarkable. The nervous energy and occasional impulsiveness of his experimental phase had been replaced by the cold calculation of a master predator preparing for the hunt of a lifetime. He moved through his building with the confidence of a spider at the center of its web, every detail carefully planned, every contingency anticipated. Holmes also used this period to establish the financial and legal frameworks that would support his expanded operations. He purchased multiple life insurance policies on key employees, created fictitious business partnerships that would allow him to claim their assets after their deaths, and developed relationships with corrupt officials who could be counted on to overlook irregularities in death certificates or missing person reports. The web of fraud and deception he wove during these years was as elaborate as the physical death trap he had constructed. The city around Holmes's building was transforming as well. Jackson Park, just a few miles from his location, was being converted into a wonderland of architectural marvels that would showcase American ingenuity and cultural achievement. The White City, as it came to be known, rose from the lakefront like a vision of the future. Gleaming buildings designed by the nation's greatest architects, landscaped grounds that rivaled European palaces, and technological innovations that promised to revolutionize modern life. But while Chicago's legitimate businessmen invested in hotels, restaurants, and entertainment venues to serve the fair's visitors, Holmes prepared accommodations of a very different sort. His building would offer more than comfortable lodging. It would provide the ultimate hospitality experience, one that guests would remember for the rest of their very short lives. The contrast between the fair's noble aspirations and Holmes's dark preparations created a psychological tension that he found deeply satisfying. While America prepared to celebrate its cultural and technological achievements, he would demonstrate the ultimate expression of human predation. The fair would showcase humanity's greatest accomplishments. His building would reveal its darkest potentials. By the spring of 1893, Holmes's preparations were complete. His killing rooms had been tested and refined, his disposal system operated with mechanical precision, and his staff had been carefully selected and positioned. The building's legitimate businesses were thriving, providing both cover for his activities and substantial revenue to fund his operations. Most importantly, reservations were pouring in from visitors who had heard about the charming Dr. Holmes and his well-appointed accommodations near the World's Fair grounds. Standing on his building's roof as the sun set over Chicago in April 1893, Holmes could see the lights of the White City beginning to twinkle in the distance. In just a few weeks, the fair would open, and the greatest migration of humanity in American history would begin flowing toward his city. Most of those people would experience the wonder and education the fair promised to provide, but a carefully selected few would find themselves guests in Holmes's establishment, where they would participate in experiments of a very different sort. The irony was delicious. While the world's Columbian Exposition celebrated human progress and achievement, Holmes would demonstrate that the most sophisticated predator in history was not some exotic beast from a distant jungle, but a well-educated American gentleman who had turned murder into both art and science. The world was indeed coming to Chicago, and Holmes was ready to give some of them a reception they would never forget. As he turned to go back inside, Holmes caught sight of his reflection in a third-floor window. The face that looked back at him was handsome, cultured, and entirely respectable, the perfect mask for the monster beneath. Tomorrow he would put the finishing touches on his preparations, and then the real work would begin. The fair would open in just 3 weeks, and Holmes intended to make it the most memorable 6 months in the history of systematic murder. The stage was set, the trap was prepared, and the victims were on their way. All that remained was to begin the harvest. Chapter 5. The fair opens, the killing begins. May 1893. The morning of May 1st, 1893 dawned clear and bright over Chicago, as if nature itself was celebrating the opening of the world's Columbian Exposition. By sunrise, thousands of visitors were already streaming toward Jackson Park, their faces bright with anticipation and wonder. The elevated railway cars were packed beyond capacity, horse-drawn omnibuses clogged the streets, and pedestrians flowed like rivers toward the gleaming white city that had risen from the lakefront marshes. From his third-floor office window, H. Holmes watched the human tide with the cold satisfaction of a fisherman observing a school of prize catchers swimming directly toward his nets. The fair's opening ceremonies would draw over 700,000 people on this single day, and the next 6 months promised to bring visitors in numbers that staggered the imagination. Holmes had spent years preparing for this moment, and now it had finally arrived. His building was fully booked for the fair's entire run, with a waiting list of hopeful guests that stretched into August. The ground floor businesses hummed with activity. The pharmacy dispensed remedies for travel fatigue, the restaurant served hearty meals to hungry sightseers, and Julia Smythe's jewellery store attracted customers seeking souvenirs worthy of their momentous visit. To any observer, Holmes's establishment appeared to be exactly what it claimed, a respectable accommodation for respectable visitors to America's greatest celebration. But appearances, as Holmes well knew, could be devastatingly deceptive. The first visitors had arrived 3 days earlier, a family from Wisconsin consisting of Robert and Mary Jenkins and their teenage daughter Sarah. They were precisely the type of guests Holmes found most suitable. Middle-class farmers who had saved for years to afford this once-in-a-lifetime trip. People whose absence from home might not be immediately noticed given the distance they had travelled. Holmes had personally welcomed them, his charm and apparent cultivation immediately putting them at ease. The Jenkins family was assigned to adjoining rooms on the second floor, accommodations that Holmes described as his finest family suite. What he didn't mention was that both rooms were equipped with his gas delivery system, and that the connecting door between them could be sealed from the outside, effectively creating a single killing chamber large enough for multiple victims. Holmes allowed the family 3 days to enjoy the fair, even engaging them in conversation about their experiences when they returned each evening. Robert Jenkins was particularly enthusiastic about the technological exhibits, while Mary marvelled at the cultural displays from around the world. Young Sarah was enchanted by the Midway's attractions and had purchased numerous souvenirs with money her parents had given her specifically for that purpose. Their enthusiasm and innocence provided Holmes with a perverse pleasure that exceeded even the anticipation of killing them. These were good people living their lives with simple decency and honest emotion, precisely the type of victims that would provide the greatest psychological satisfaction when he destroyed them. The contrast between their wholesome humanity and his calculated evil created a tension that Holmes found intoxicating. On their 4th night in the building, as the Jenkins family settled into their rooms after another day of wonder at the fair, Holmes made his move. He waited until the building's other guests were asleep, then sealed the connecting door between the family's rooms and activated the gas delivery system from his control panel. The compound he had chosen was a mixture of his own design: chloroform to render them unconscious quickly, followed by pure carbon monoxide to ensure death without the violent struggles that might alert other guests. Through the speaking tubes that connected both rooms to his office, Holmes listened to the family's final minutes with clinical attention. Robert Jenkins was the first to notice something was wrong, his voice slurred and confused as he tried to wake his wife. Mary's last conscious words were a warning to her daughter, though by then Sarah was already unconscious on the bed where she had been reading a book about the fair's exhibits. The entire process took less than 20 minutes from activation to complete silence, an efficiency that pleased Holmes enormously. The Jenkins family had transitioned from life to death as smoothly as passengers boarding a train, and their bodies now awaited processing in Holmes's basement facility. But the Jenkins family was merely the opening act in Holmes's grand performance. As May progressed and the fair's attendance soared, Holmes refined his selection process and increased his operational tempo. He developed a system for identifying the most suitable victims from among his guests, focusing on individuals or small groups whose disappearances would be least likely to trigger immediate investigations. Amanda Pierce, a schoolteacher from rural Indiana, had saved for 3 years to afford her trip to the fair. She travelled alone, a brave decision for a woman in 1893, and had booked a room in Holmes' building specifically because of its reputation for safety and respectability. Holmes found her intellectual curiosity and independent spirit particularly appealing. She would provide an interesting contrast to his previous victims. Amanda lasted 6 days before Holmes decided she had outlived her usefulness. She had grown suspicious of the building's strange sounds, and had begun asking uncomfortable questions about other guests who seemed to have checked out in the middle of the night without collecting their belongings. Her teacher's instincts for observation and analysis made her a liability that Holmes couldn't afford to maintain. Her death was more elaborate than the Jenkins family's efficient elimination. Holmes used Amanda to test the capabilities of Room 3C, his soundproof torture chamber. He wanted to explore the psychological responses of an educated woman under extreme duress, and Amanda's isolation from family and friends provided him with the perfect opportunity for extended experimentation. The session lasted 4 hours and provided Holmes with data that would influence his techniques for the remainder of the fair's run. Amanda's intellectual nature created resistance patterns that differed significantly from his previous victims, and her attempts to reason with him revealed psychological dynamics that Holmes found fascinating. Her death, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic after the intensity of her struggle to maintain dignity and hope in the face of unimaginable horror. As spring turned to summer and the fair's attendance reached its peak, Holmes's operations achieved an industrial efficiency that surpassed his most optimistic projections. He had developed a systematic approach to victim selection, processing, and disposal that allowed him to handle multiple deaths simultaneously while maintaining the building's facade of normalcy. The basement had become a marvel of organized horror. Bodies moved through the processing system with assembly line precision. Initial preparation in the dissection area, skeleton articulation in the cleaning facility, organ preservation in the chemical laboratory, and final disposal via cremation or acid dissolution. Holmes had even installed a primitive ventilation system that prevented the smells of death from reaching the upper floors where legitimate guests continued their stays. Julia Smythe's role in Holmes's operations had evolved throughout the spring and summer. Initially unaware of her employer's true activities, she had gradually become suspicious of the building's irregularities and the disappearance of guests she had personally welcomed. Her growing unease reached a crisis point in July when she discovered bloodstains in a supposedly vacant room and confronted Holmes about what she had seen. Holmes's response revealed both his psychological sophistication and his complete lack of human empathy. Rather than denying her accusations or attempting to deceive her further, he calmly confirmed her worst suspicions and explained that she now faced a simple choice: become a willing participant in his operations or join his victims in the basement. Julia's love for her daughter, Pearl, combined with her complete financial dependence on Holmes, made the decision inevitable. From that point forward, Julia became Holmes's most valuable accomplice. Her natural charm and apparent respectability made guests trust her completely, while her intimate knowledge of each visitor's background and circumstances allowed Holmes to select victims with unprecedented precision. She learned to identify travellers who were isolated from family, guests whose extended absence wouldn't be immediately noticed, and individuals whose personal secrets made them unlikely to confide their suspicions to others. But Holmes's plans for Julia extended far beyond her usefulness as an accomplice. He had been documenting her complicity in his crimes, creating a detailed record that would ensure her silence and cooperation. More importantly, he had been gradually poisoning her, using the same slow-acting compounds that had proved so effective with Mrs. Holton years earlier. Julia's health had been declining throughout the summer, though she attributed her symptoms to stress and overwork. Young Pearl Smythe represented perhaps Holmes's most ambitious challenge. The 8-year-old had become a favourite among the building's guests, her innocent charm and precocious intelligence making her a welcome sight in the lobby and shops. But for Holmes, Pearl was the ultimate test of his evolving techniques. Could he kill a child with the same clinical efficiency he brought to adult victims? Would a child's death provide the psychological satisfaction he expected, or would it prove to be an anticlimactic exercise? As August arrived and the fair reached its halfway point, Holmes reflected on his achievements with deep satisfaction. He had killed 17 people since the fair's opening, each death contributing to his growing understanding of human psychology under extreme duress. His disposal system had processed the bodies with mechanical efficiency, while his cover businesses continued to generate substantial profits and maintain his public reputation. The contrast between his public and private activities provided Holmes with a philosophical satisfaction that equaled the visceral pleasure of murder itself. While millions of visitors celebrated human achievement and progress at the White City, he had demonstrated the ultimate expression of human predation just a few miles away. The fair represented humanity's highest aspirations. His building revealed its darkest potentials. Standing in his office as the sun set over Chicago on August 15th, Holmes could see the lights of the fair twinkling in the distance like stars in an earthbound constellation. Tomorrow would bring new guests, new opportunities, and new contributions to his ever-expanding understanding of systematic murder. The fair would continue for 2 more months, and Holmes intended to make every day count. The killing had begun, and Holmes was just getting started. The greatest harvest in the history of American murder was only half complete, and the best was yet to come. In Chapter 6, The Insurance Schemes, Summer 1893, by midsummer, Holmes had discovered that murder could be far more than a source of personal satisfaction. It could be extraordinarily profitable. While the visceral pleasure of killing remained his primary motivation, the financial opportunities presented by systematic murder had begun to capture his entrepreneurial imagination. The World's Fair provided not only an abundance of victims, but also the perfect cover for the most elaborate insurance fraud schemes in American history. The revelation came to Holmes through Benjamin Petezel, a carpenter and petty criminal from Philadelphia, who had arrived in Chicago seeking work related to the fair's construction projects. Petezel was everything Holmes needed in an accomplice: intelligent enough to understand complex schemes, but desperate enough to ignore their moral implications, skilled with his hands but naive about the true scope of Holmes's operations, and most importantly completely isolated from family or friends who might investigate his eventual disappearance. Holmes had initially planned to kill Petezel within weeks of his arrival, but their first conversation revealed possibilities that extended far beyond simple murder. Peter Zell had extensive experience with insurance fraud, having worked with criminal gangs in Philadelphia who specialized in staging accidents and deaths for policy payouts. His knowledge of insurance company procedures, combined with his skills at document forgery and identity manipulation, made him invaluable for Holmes' expanding ambitions. Their partnership began with a relatively simple scheme involving Robert Morrison, a traveling salesman from Ohio who had checked into Holmes's hotel in late June. Morrison was perfect for their purposes, middle-aged, unmarried, and carrying substantial life insurance policies that would pay benefits to his estate. More importantly, Morrison's work required extensive travel, meaning his disappearance might not be noticed for weeks or even months. Holmes and Pettezel's plan was elegantly simple. They would kill Morrison and stage his death to appear accidental, then use forged documents to claim his identity and collect the insurance payouts. Peter Zell's expertise in document forgery would create a complete false identity, while Holmes's medical knowledge would ensure the staged death appeared completely natural. Morrison's murder took place in room 2F, Holmes's gas chamber, but instead of disposing of the body through his usual processing system, Holmes transported it to an abandoned warehouse on Chicago's south side. There, he and Peter Zell staged an industrial accident, crushing Morrison's skull with machinery and positioning the body to suggest a workplace mishap that would explain both the cause of death and the victim's presence in an unfamiliar location. The insurance claims process proceeded flawlessly. Peter Zell presented himself at Morrison's insurance company offices in Cleveland, using forged documents to establish his identity as Morrison's business partner and designated beneficiary. Holmes provided medical testimony about Morrison's death, his credentials as a physician lending credibility to the accident scenario. Within 6 weeks, they'd collected over $8,000 in benefits, more money than most Americans earned in a decade. Encouraged by this success, Holmes and Peter Zell refined their methods and expanded their operations throughout the summer. They developed a systematic approach to victim selection that prioritized individuals with substantial insurance coverage, minimal family connections, and occupations that would explain their presence in Chicago during the fair. Traveling salesmen, independent businessmen, and professional visitors became their preferred targets. The scheme involving Charles Williams, a hardware wholesaler from Detroit, demonstrated the sophistication their partnership had achieved. Williams carried over $15,000 in life insurance and had booked an extended stay at Holmes's hotel to conduct business throughout the fair's run. Holmes spent 3 weeks cultivating Williams' trust, learning about his business practices, personal habits, and family situation. When the moment came to eliminate him, Holmes was prepared with complete identity documentation and intimate knowledge of Williams' professional relationships. Williams' death was staged as a heart attack, with Holmes using his medical expertise to induce cardiac arrest through a carefully administered combination of drugs. The body was then transported to Williams' hotel room at a different establishment, where it was discovered by hotel staff the following morning. Holmes appeared as the attending physician, his examination confirming the apparent cause of death and deflecting any suspicions about foul play. Pettezel, meanwhile, had spent weeks in Detroit establishing himself in Williams' business circles, using forged letters of introduction and his natural charm to build credibility. When news of Williams' death reached Detroit, Pettezel was perfectly positioned to step forward as his business partner and insurance beneficiary. The claims were processed without question, netting the partnership another substantial windfall. But Holmes's most audacious insurance scheme involved Julia Smythe and her daughter Pearl, the very people who had become his closest associates in the building's operations. By August, Julia's health had declined to the point where her death seemed imminent, a decline that Holmes had carefully orchestrated through months of gradual poisoning. Rather than simply allowing her to die and disposing of her body through his usual methods, Holmes saw an opportunity for unprecedented profit. Julia's life was insured for $12,000, a substantial sum that Holmes had encouraged her to purchase shortly after her employment began. The policy listed Pearl as the primary beneficiary, with Holmes designated as Pearl's guardian in the event of Julia's death. Holmes's long-term plan was elegant in its simplicity. Julia's death would provide an immediate insurance payout, while Pearl's subsequent elimination would leave Holmes in complete control of the benefits. The psychological manipulation required to implement this scheme demonstrated Holmes's sophisticated understanding of human nature. He convinced Julia that her deteriorating health was due to stress and overwork, prescribing medications that actually accelerated her decline while appearing to provide temporary relief. He also cultivated an increasingly paternal relationship with Pearl, positioning himself as the only stable figure in her life as her mother became increasingly incapacitated. Julia's death in mid-August was staged as a sudden collapse due to heart failure, a diagnosis that Holmes's medical credentials made unquestionable. Her funeral was attended by dozens of mourners who praised Holmes's devotion to his employee and his generosity in caring for her orphaned daughter. The insurance claim was processed within days, the payout delivered to Pearl's account with Holmes as the designated administrator. Pearl's own elimination, planned for early September, would be Holmes's masterpiece of psychological manipulation. He had spent months building her trust and affection, becoming the father figure she had never known. Her death would test his ability to kill someone who genuinely loved and trusted him, the ultimate expression of his complete separation from human emotion and moral constraint. But the insurance schemes had revealed unexpected complications that threatened Holmes's carefully constructed facade. The sudden deaths of multiple hotel guests, combined with the convenient appearance of business partners to claim insurance benefits, had begun to attract attention from investigators who specialized in insurance fraud. While individual claims appeared legitimate, the pattern of deaths associated with Holmes' establishment suggested systematic criminal activity. Detective agencies employed by major insurance companies had begun sharing information about suspicious claims originating from Chicago during the fair period. Holmes's name appeared in multiple case files, always in peripheral roles that individually seemed innocent but collectively suggested deeper involvement. The challenge facing Holmes was how to continue his profitable operations while avoiding the scrutiny that might expose his entire enterprise. The solution came through Pittersill's criminal contacts in Philadelphia, who introduced Holmes to corrupt officials within insurance companies who could be bribed to expedite claims and suppress investigations. For a percentage of each payout, these officials would ensure that suspicious claims were approved quickly and that investigation requests were buried in bureaucratic delays. The network of corruption that Holmes constructed during this period extended from Chicago to New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, creating a criminal infrastructure that could support expanded operations. By September, Holmes and Pettersille had successfully claimed over $75,000 in fraudulent insurance benefits, an enormous sum that exceeded the annual revenues of most legitimate businesses. More importantly, they had perfected techniques that could be applied on an even larger scale once the fair ended, and they could expand their operations beyond Chicago. But success bred overconfidence, and overconfidence would prove to be Holmes' greatest vulnerability. The systematic nature of his insurance schemes created documentation that would eventually allow investigators to trace his activities across multiple states and jurisdictions. Every forged document, every false identity, and every fraudulent claim left evidence that could be assembled into an overwhelming case against him. Standing in his office on a warm September evening, Holmes reviewed the financial records that documented his summer's work. The insurance schemes had generated more money than he had ever imagined possible, while the murders that made them possible had provided the psychological satisfaction that remained his primary motivation. The fair would end in just a few weeks, but Holmes was already planning for the future, a future that would take his operations nationwide and establish him as America's premier criminal entrepreneur. The insurance schemes had taught Holmes that murder could be more than an art form. It could be a business model, and like any successful businessman, he was ready to expand into new markets and explore new opportunities. The fair had been his testing ground. The rest of America would be his hunting preserve. As he locked the financial records in his hidden safe and prepared to check on his evening's potential victims, Holmes smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had discovered his true calling. He wasn't just America's first serial killer, he was America's first systematic criminal entrepreneur, and his best work was yet to come. Chapter 7: The Vault of Horrors. Late 1893, as autumn descended upon Chicago and the World's Fair entered its final months, Holmes's basement had evolved into something that defied comprehension, a mechanized cathedral of death that operated with the efficiency of a modern factory. the space that had begun as a simple disposal facility had grown into an industrial complex dedicated to the systematic processing of human remains, where every square foot served a specific purpose in Holmes' expanding empire of murder. The basement's layout reflected Holmes' methodical approach to mass killing. The main processing area occupied the center of the space, equipped with drainage systems that could handle the blood from multiple bodies simultaneously. Overhead pulley systems, originally installed to move heavy equipment, now served to transport corpses from the killing rooms above through hidden chutes and passages that Holmes had constructed throughout the building's 3 floors. The dissection station represented the pinnacle of Holmes' medical expertise applied to criminal purposes. Here, bodies were efficiently stripped of flesh using techniques he had perfected through dozens of victims. Holmes had discovered that human bodies could be processed with assembly line efficiency. Skin and muscle tissue removed in predetermined patterns, organs extracted and sorted by commercial value, and bones cleaned and prepared for articulation. The entire process, from fresh corpse to sellable skeleton, could be completed in under 6 hours by a skilled operator. Holmes had become that skilled operator, his medical training combining with practical experience to create an expertise in human anatomy that few legitimate physicians could match. He had dissected more corpses in the past year than most medical students encountered in their entire education, and his understanding of human physiology had reached levels that bordered on the supernatural. He could predict with uncanny accuracy how long a victim would survive under specific torture conditions, which organs would remain viable for preservation after particular killing methods, and how different body types would respond to his various disposal techniques. The chemical processing area housed Holmes' most sophisticated equipment. Industrial-grade acid vats, each capable of completely dissolving a human body in less than 12 hours, lined one wall of the basement. The acid mixture was Holmes' own formulation, combining sulfuric acid with quicklime and specialized catalysts that accelerated decomposition, while preventing the telltale odors that might alert neighbors or authorities. Adjacent to the acid vats, quicklime pits provided an alternative disposal method for occasions when complete dissolution wasn't necessary. The crematorium represented Holmes' masterpiece of engineering innovation. Disguised as the building's heating system, the furnace could reduce a human body to ash in under 3 hours, while appearing to provide legitimate heating for the floors above. Holmes had installed sophisticated ventilation systems that dispersed cremation smoke through multiple chimney outlets, preventing the concentration of odors or unusual emissions that might attract attention. The ash produced by human cremation was indistinguishable from coal residue, allowing Holmes to dispose of it with normal heating waste. But the basement's most profitable area was Holmes' anatomical preparation facility. Here, cleaned skeletons were articulated and mounted for sale to medical schools, teaching hospitals and private physicians throughout the Midwest. Holmes had established relationships with procurement officers at dozens of institutions, his reputation for providing high-quality specimens making him a preferred supplier despite his premium pricing. A single well-prepared human skeleton could sell for $200 or more, enough to justify multiple murders from a purely financial perspective. The organ preservation laboratory allowed Holmes to maximize the commercial value of each victim. Hearts, livers, kidneys, and other organs were preserved in formaldehyde solutions and sold to medical schools for dissection practice. Holmes had developed specialized techniques for maintaining organ integrity that made his specimens particularly valuable for educational purposes. Brain tissue, preserved in alcohol solutions, commanded especially high prices from neurological researchers studying mental disorders and criminal psychology. The basement also housed Holmes' documentation center, where he maintained detailed records of each victim's processing. These records weren't motivated by sentimentality or morbid fascination. They were business documents that tracked inventory, calculated profits, and identified the most efficient processing methods for different victim types. Holmes recorded everything from initial killing times to final disposal costs, creating a database of murder that would have impressed any legitimate business analyst. The psychological impact of working in this environment had transformed Holmes in ways that even he found remarkable. The basement represented complete separation from conventional human morality, a space where people ceased to be individuals and became raw materials for industrial processing. Holmes found himself thinking about potential victims in terms of their commercial value, mentally calculating skeleton articulation potential while engaging in casual conversation, estimating organ preservation possibilities while sharing dinner with unsuspecting guests. This transformation was most evident in Holmes's treatment of Julia Smythe's daughter, Pearl. The 8-year-old had become a regular visitor to the basement, Holmes having convinced her that he was conducting scientific experiments that would advance medical knowledge and help sick people. Pearl's innocent fascination with the equipment and processes provided Holmes with perhaps his greatest psychological satisfaction: the complete corruption of childhood innocence through systematic exposure to industrial-scale murder. Pearl's presence in the basement also served practical purposes. Her childish questions forced Holmes to develop explanations for his equipment and procedures that would satisfy adult curiosity if unexpected visitors discovered his operations. More importantly, her comfort in the space of death demonstrated to any observer that nothing sinister could be occurring in an area where a child played freely. The financial success of Holmes's basement operations exceeded his most optimistic projections. By November 1893, the facility was processing an average of 3 bodies per week, while maintaining perfect secrecy and generating substantial profits from skeleton and organ sales. The medical supply business had become so successful that Holmes was considering expanding his operations to include multiple locations throughout the Midwest. But the basement's true horror lay not in its efficiency or profitability, but in the psychological transformation it represented. Holmes had created a space where murder became routine, where human suffering was systematically exploited for financial gain, and where the most fundamental taboos of civilization were violated as matter of course. The basement wasn't just a killing facility, it was a monument to the complete absence of human empathy and moral constraint. The victims who met their end in Holmes' basement represented every segment of American society: traveling businessmen, young women seeking employment, immigrant families pursuing the American dream, elderly visitors fulfilling lifelong ambitions to see the World's Fair. All had found their way into Holmes's processing system, their individual stories and dreams reduced to inventory entries in his meticulous records. The processing of Sarah Chen, a young Chinese woman who had traveled from San Francisco to experience American culture at the fair, illustrated the systematic nature of Holmes's operations. Sarah had been killed in room 2A, the suffocation chamber, after 3 days of imprisonment, during which Holmes had tested various psychological torture techniques. Her body had been transported to the basement via the hidden chute system, processed through the dissection station, and converted into commercial products within 8 hours of death. Sarah's skeleton, articulated with particular care due to its anatomical uniqueness, had sold to Northwestern Medical School for $300. Her organs, preserved using Holmes' specialized techniques, had generated another $150 in sales to various research institutions. Even her hair, which Holmes had learned could be sold to wig manufacturers, had provided additional revenue. From a purely business perspective, Sarah Chen had been one of Holmes' most profitable victims. The basement had also become Holmes' retreat from the increasingly complex social demands of his public persona. While the upper floors required him to maintain the facade of a charming, successful businessman, the basement allowed him to exist as his true self, a creature of pure predatory instinct, unencumbered by moral constraints or social expectations. Here he could indulge his darkest appetites while pursuing his commercial interests with single-minded focus. As the World's Fair entered its final weeks and visitor traffic began to decline, Holmes reflected on what he had accomplished in his Vault of Horrors. The basement had processed over 60 bodies since the fair's opening, generating profits that exceeded $30,000 while providing him with psychological satisfaction that no conventional pleasure could match. More importantly, it had proved that systematic murder could be conducted on an industrial scale while maintaining perfect secrecy and social respectability. Standing among his acid vats and processing equipment as November winds rattled the building above, Holmes felt the profound satisfaction of a man who had achieved his life's ambition. He had created the perfect killing machine, a facility that could eliminate human beings with the efficiency of a slaughterhouse while generating substantial profits from their remains. The fair would end soon, but his basement would continue operating, processing the steady stream of victims that his expanding operations would provide. The Vault of Horrors had exceeded every expectation, and Holmes was already planning improvements that would increase its capacity and efficiency. the basement represented his greatest achievement, a monument to systematic evil that would serve as the foundation for even greater horrors to come. Chapter 8. The Fair's Dark Shadow. October 1893. The closing ceremony of the World's Columbian Exposition took place on October 30th, 1893, beneath grey skies that seemed to mirror the city's melancholy at seeing its greatest triumph come to an end. As dignitaries delivered speeches about Chicago's achievement and America's bright future, 27 million visitors began their journeys home, carrying memories of wonder and inspiration that would last their lifetimes. But for some visitors, the fair's end would bring no memories at all. They would never leave Chicago, their remains already processed through Holmes' basement facility, and their absence explained away by forged correspondence and fabricated travel plans. Holmes stood among the crowd gathered for the closing ceremonies, his appearance as respectable and cultured as any of the civic leaders who had made the fair possible. To observers, he seemed to share the general sadness at the end of Chicago's great celebration. In reality, he was calculating how many of the departing visitors might be intercepted before they reached their trains, and which of his remaining hotel guests could be eliminated before their planned checkout dates. The fair's conclusion created both opportunities and challenges for Holmes' operations. On one hand, the massive exodus of visitors provided perfect cover for disappearances. Missing persons could be explained as delayed departures, changed travel plans, or simple failures to communicate with worried families. On the other hand, the end of the fair meant the end of the steady stream of isolated visitors who had provided such perfect victims throughout the summer and fall. Holmes had anticipated this transition and spent the fair's final weeks implementing what he privately called his harvest protocol, the systematic elimination of guests and staff who possessed knowledge that could threaten his operations or who represented unfinished business from his summer's work. The protocol required careful timing and flawless execution, as any mistakes during this critical period could expose his entire enterprise. Julia Smythe's daughter Pearl represented the most significant loose end in Holmes' operations. The 8-year-old had witnessed far too much during her months in the building, her childish curiosity having led her into areas and situations that could provide damaging testimony if she ever spoke to the wrong people. More importantly, Pearl represented Holmes's ultimate test as a systematic killer. Could he murder a child who trusted him completely, who had come to view him as a father figure, who approached him with the innocent affection that most people reserved for family? Holmes had been preparing Pearl's elimination for weeks, gradually isolating her from any adults who might protect her, while building her dependence on his approval and affection. With Julia dead and buried in the basement's quicklime pits, Pearl had no one in the world except the man who planned to kill her. The psychological dynamics of the situation provided Holmes with satisfaction that exceeded even his anticipation of the murder itself. The method Holmes chose for Pearl's death reflected both his practical needs and his desire for psychological completion. Rather than using one of his mechanical killing rooms, he decided to murder Pearl personally, using his bare hands to demonstrate his complete dominance over human life. The act would take place in the basement, surrounded by the processing equipment that had handled so many other victims, in full view of the acid vats and skeletal remains that testified to Holmes's systematic evil. On the evening of November 15th, Holmes lured Pearl to the basement with promises of showing her a special surprise related to his scientific work. The child followed him eagerly, her trust absolute and her excitement genuine. Even as they descended the stairs into the realm of death that Holmes had created, Pearl chatted happily about her day and asked questions about the equipment she saw around her. Holmes's murder of Pearl Smythe lasted nearly an hour, not because the child was able to resist, but because Holmes wanted to savour every moment of the ultimate violation of human trust and innocence. He began by explaining what he intended to do, watching Pearl's confusion transform into terror as she realised that the man she had loved and trusted was going to kill her. The psychological torture that preceded the physical murder provided Holmes with sensations that surpassed anything he had experienced in his previous killings. Pearl's death marked a psychological watershed for Holmes. The murder of an innocent child who had loved him unconditionally proved that he had achieved complete separation from human emotion and moral constraint. If he could kill Pearl Smythe without remorse or hesitation, then no potential victim would ever again present psychological barriers to his ambitions. He had become the perfect predator, utterly ruthless, completely calculating, and entirely without conscience. The processing of Pearl's body through Holmes' basement facility provided him with a final confirmation of his transformation. The child who had played among his equipment just hours earlier was systematically converted into commercial products with the same mechanical efficiency applied to all his other victims. Her skeleton, articulated with particular care due to its small size and perfect condition, would eventually sell to a pediatric medical program for $250. Her organs, preserved using Holmes's specialized techniques, would contribute to research on childhood development and disease. Even in death, Pearl Smythe would serve Holmes's commercial interests. But Pearl's murder was only one element of Holmes's harvest protocol. Throughout November, he systematically eliminated staff members who had gained too much knowledge of his operations during the fair's run. Margaret Thompson, who had cleaned the upper floors and occasionally noticed bloodstains in supposedly vacant rooms, died in room 2F after asking too many questions about guests who seemed to check out without taking their luggage. Robert Stein, a maintenance worker who had discovered hidden passages and questioned their purpose, was found dead in the basement after what appeared to be an accidental fall down an elevator shaft. The elimination of witnesses required different techniques than Holmes typically employed with his chosen victims. These weren't murders for pleasure or profit. They were necessary business operations designed to protect his long-term interests. Accordingly, Holmes focused on methods that would appear accidental or natural, avoiding the elaborate torture sessions that he preferred for recreational killings. Speed and certainty were more important than psychological satisfaction in these practical murders. Holmes also used the post-fair period to eliminate several guests whose extended stays had made them inconvenient rather than profitable. Edward Morrison, a retired banker from St. Louis who had booked a month-long stay to enjoy Chicago's cultural offerings, was killed after he began asking uncomfortable questions about other guests who had supposedly left without saying goodbye. His death was staged as a heart attack, Holmes's medical credentials lending credibility to the diagnosis while allowing him to avoid an official autopsy. The Harvest Protocol's most complex element involved the systematic destruction of evidence that could link Holmes to his victims' disappearances. Forged letters explaining delayed travel plans were mailed from various cities to worried families. Hotel registration records were altered to show earlier departure dates, and personal belongings were carefully disposed of through networks of fences and pawn dealers. Holmes had learned from his insurance schemes that documentation could be as dangerous as witnesses, and he applied the same systematic approach to evidence elimination that he brought to human murder. The financial accounting of Holmes' fair operations provided him with deep satisfaction as 1893 drew to a close. Between direct murders for profit, insurance fraud schemes, and the commercial sale of anatomical specimens, his operations had generated over $150,000 in revenue, an enormous sum that exceeded the annual income of most major businesses. More importantly, he had perfected techniques and established networks that could support even larger operations in the future. But the fair's end also brought new challenges that would test Holmes' ability to adapt and survive. The massive population of transient visitors that had provided such perfect victims was dispersing, forcing him to develop new hunting methods and victim selection criteria. Law enforcement agencies were beginning to share information about suspicious disappearances during the fair period, creating the possibility that patterns might be discovered that could lead to his operations. Most significantly, the success of his basement processing facility had created evidence that could prove devastating if discovered by the wrong people. Holmes's response to these challenges demonstrated the calculating intelligence that had made his murder spree possible. Rather than reducing his operations or attempting to lay low, he decided to expand beyond Chicago, taking his techniques and experience to new hunting grounds, where his reputation and methods were unknown. The fair had been his testing ground. The rest of America would become his hunting preserve. As 1893 ended and Holmes prepared for the next phase of his career, he reflected on what the fair had taught him about the possibilities for systematic murder in modern America. The 6 months of the Exposition had proved that mass killing could be conducted in the heart of a major city without detection, that bodies could be disposed of using industrial techniques that left no trace, and that the right combination of charm and careful planning could provide access to unlimited victims. Standing in his basement as snow began to fall over Chicago, Holmes surveyed the equipment and facilities that had made his success possible. The fair was over, but his work was just beginning. The Vault of Horrors would continue operating, the harvest would continue, and Holmes would continue evolving into something that transcended conventional definitions of human evil. The fair's dark shadow had fallen across Chicago, and it would follow Holmes wherever his ambitions led him next. The Chapter 9, Flight and Betrayal, November 1893, 1894. The first snowfall of winter blanketed Chicago on November 28, 1893, covering the city in pristine white that concealed the blood-soaked ground beneath. For Holmes, the snow represented both opportunity and necessity. Opportunity to escape a city that was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about missing fair visitors, and necessity driven by increasing attention from insurance investigators who had begun connecting suspicious claims to his establishment. The catalyst for Holmes's departure came through Detective Frank Geyer of the Philadelphia Police Department, who had begun investigating a series of insurance claims involving Benjamin Pitezel. Geyer's methodical approach to investigation and his refusal to accept convenient explanations had led him to Chicago, where he was asking questions about Pitezel's activities during the fair period. More ominously, Geyer had begun requesting information about other suspicious deaths and disappearances associated with Holmes's building. Holmes recognized the threat that Geyer represented and knew that his Chicago operations had reached their natural conclusion. The fair's end had eliminated his primary source of victims, while increased scrutiny made continued operations in the city increasingly dangerous. More importantly, Holmes had achieved everything he had hoped to accomplish in Chicago. He had perfected his killing techniques, established profitable disposal methods, and accumulated enough capital to fund expanded operations elsewhere. But Holmes's departure from Chicago would not be a simple matter of packing his belongings and catching a train. His building contained too much evidence to abandon, his staff knew too much to survive his departure, and his basement facility required systematic destruction to prevent discovery. Most critically, Holmes needed to eliminate Benjamin Pitezel, whose knowledge of the insurance schemes made him the greatest single threat to Holmes' future operations. The solution Holmes devised demonstrated both his strategic thinking and his complete ruthlessness. He would stage Pitezel's death in Philadelphia, collect the substantial life insurance policy they had purchased for exactly this purpose, then use Pitezel's widow and children as cover for his escape, while systematically eliminating them to prevent any possibility of testimony against him. The plan would provide financial resources for his next venture, while removing all witnesses to his Chicago activities. Holmes began implementing his departure strategy in December 1893, starting with the systematic elimination of his Chicago staff. The process required careful timing to avoid creating suspicions through too many sudden deaths, but Holmes had perfected techniques for making murder appear accidental or natural. Margaret Walsh, who had managed the building's restaurant, died of apparent food poisoning after consuming oysters that Holmes had personally prepared. Thomas Bradley, the maintenance supervisor who had installed some of Holmes's killing equipment, suffered a fatal fall down the basement stairs during what appeared to be routine inspection work. The destruction of physical evidence required even more meticulous planning. Holmes couldn't simply burn his building. Too many people knew about its unusual construction and specialized equipment. Instead, he began systematically dismantling the most incriminating elements of his operations while preparing the structure for a fire that would appear accidental but would destroy any remaining traces of his activities. The acid vats were drained and filled with concrete, their true purpose disguised as foundation repair work. The gas delivery systems were removed and the pipes sealed, the work explained as modernization of the building's heating systems. Most challenging of all, the hidden passages and secret rooms had to be sealed in ways that would prevent discovery even after a thorough fire investigation. Holmes's most complex challenge involved the disposal of the dozens of skeletons and preserved organs that represented his most valuable inventory. These specimens couldn't be destroyed. They were worth thousands of dollars and would fund his operations in new locations. Instead, Holmes arranged for their transfer to accomplices in other cities, using medical supply networks he had cultivated during his Chicago operations to move the evidence far from any potential investigation. The financial aspects of Holmes's departure were handled with the same systematic approach he applied to murder. Outstanding debts were left unpaid, insurance policies were allowed to lapse, and business relationships were terminated through forged correspondence that suggested Holmes had died in a tragic accident. By February 1894, Dr. H. Holmes had officially ceased to exist in Chicago, though the man himself was very much alive and preparing for his next venture. Holmes's relationship with the Pitezel family during this period revealed the depths of his psychological manipulation abilities. Carrie Pitezel, Benjamin's wife, trusted Holmes completely, viewing him as her husband's business partner and their family's benefactor. Her 5 children, Alice, Nellie, Howard, Dessie, and baby Wharton, had grown fond of the charming Dr. Holmes, who brought them gifts and treated them with apparent kindness and concern. What the Pitezel family couldn't know was that Holmes viewed them not as friends or associates, but as raw materials for his next series of murders. Benjamin would die first, his death staged to collect insurance benefits while providing Holmes with the cover story he needed for travelling with the surviving family members. The wife and children would then be eliminated systematically, their deaths spread across multiple states to prevent pattern recognition, while Holmes established himself in new hunting grounds. The murder of Benjamin Pitezel took place in Philadelphia on September 2, 1894, in a rented office where Holmes had established a false identity as a patent medicine inventor. Holmes convinced Pitezel to help him stage an explosion that would destroy incriminating evidence from their Chicago operations, then used the explosion to kill Pitezel while making his death appear accidental. The body was discovered by authorities who accepted Holmes's explanation that Pitezel had died while conducting dangerous chemical experiments. Holmes's manipulation of Carrie Pitezel following her husband's death represented psychological torture of the highest order. He convinced her that Benjamin had survived the explosion, but was in hiding from authorities investigating their insurance schemes, then offered to reunite her with her husband if she would trust him to arrange secret meetings. Carrie's desperation to see her husband alive made her accept Holmes' increasingly bizarre instructions without question. The systematic murder of the Pitezel children began in October 1894, as Holmes travelled across the country with different family members while keeping them isolated from each other. Alice and Nellie Pitezel, aged 15 and 11, were taken to Toronto under the pretense of meeting their father. Instead, Holmes rented a house on St. Vincent Street and spent several days preparing the girls for death through psychological torture that surpassed even his treatment of Pearl Smythe. Holmes's murder of Alice and Nellie Pitezel demonstrated his evolution as a killer. No longer content with quick deaths that served purely practical purposes, he had returned to the elaborate torture sessions that provided him with maximum psychological satisfaction. The girls were kept imprisoned in the Toronto house for nearly a week, during which Holmes subjected them to systematic abuse designed to break their spirits before ending their lives. The Toronto murders also revealed Holmes' growing carelessness and overconfidence. Unlike his Chicago operations, where every detail had been planned and every contingency anticipated, the Pitezel children's deaths left evidence that careful investigation could discover. Holmes's rental of the St. Vincent Street house was documented. Neighbours had seen him with the children, and the disposal of their bodies was less thorough than his Chicago techniques required. Young Howard Pitezel's death in Indianapolis represented Holmes' final experiment in child murder. The 10-year-old boy had been travelling with Holmes under the pretense of reuniting with his sisters, never knowing that Alice and Nellie were already dead and buried in Toronto. Holmes rented a house in Irvington, a suburb of Indianapolis, where he could conduct Howard's murder without interference or observation. Howard's death was particularly cruel even by Holmes's standards. The boy's trust and affection for Holmes made his betrayal and murder psychologically devastating, while Holmes's decision to use a more prolonged killing method demonstrated his complete lack of human empathy. Howard was locked in a trunk for several hours before being suffocated, his final moments spent in darkness and terror as he realized that the man he had trusted was going to kill him. The disposal of Howard's body revealed both Holmes' expertise and his growing desperation. Unlike his Chicago facility, which could process corpses with industrial efficiency, Holmes was forced to rely on improvised methods that left more evidence and required greater risks. Howard's body was dismembered and buried in the basement of the Irvington house, the work conducted hastily and without the systematic approach that had served Holmes so well in Chicago. By December 1894, Holmes had eliminated the entire Pitezel family, except for the youngest children, who remained with relatives who didn't know about their family's connection to Holmes. The insurance benefits from Benjamin's death had provided Holmes with substantial capital, while the elimination of witnesses had removed the greatest threats to his continued operations. But the Pittersell murders had also created evidence that would prove to be Holmes's downfall. Detective Frank Geyer's investigation had continued throughout Holmes' cross-country killing spree, his methodical approach gradually uncovering the trail of forged documents, false identities, and suspicious deaths that marked Holmes's passage. More importantly, Geyer had begun collaborating with investigators in other cities, sharing information that was starting to reveal the true scope of Holmes's criminal activities. Standing in a hotel room in Boston as 1894 drew to a close, Holmes reflected on what he had accomplished during his year of flight and betrayal. He had successfully escaped Chicago before his operations could be discovered, eliminated all witnesses to his crimes, and collected substantial insurance benefits that would fund his future activities. But he had also left a trail of evidence that a determined investigator could follow, and Detective Geyer was proving to be exactly that kind of investigator. The flight from Chicago had been successful, but Holmes was beginning to realize that betrayal carried costs that even his calculating mind had not fully anticipated. The Pittersell family's murders had been necessary for his survival, but they had also created the evidence that would eventually destroy him. The predator had become the prey, and the hunt was closing in. The Chapter 10, The Children's Last Journey, 1894. The Union Station in Indianapolis bustled with the energy of American commerce on the crisp morning of October 25th, 1894. As travellers hurried between platforms carrying satchels and dreams toward destinations across the expanding continent. Among the crowd, a well-dressed gentleman escorted a young boy toward the departing train to Cincinnati, their conversation apparently casual and their relationship seemingly that of a caring uncle with his beloved nephew. But appearances, as always with H. Holmes, masked a reality so horrific that the other travellers, had they known the truth, would have torn him apart with their bare hands. The boy was Howard Pittersell, 10 years old, travelling under the belief that he was going to reunite with his father and sisters, who were waiting for him in Cincinnati. In reality, Howard was journeying toward his own carefully planned murder, the final victim in Holmes's systematic elimination of the Pittersell family. Holmes had spent months perfecting his manipulation of the surviving Pittersell children, keeping them separated while feeding each elaborate lies about the other's whereabouts and well-being. To Howard, Alice and Nellie were safe with their father in a secret location, where the family would soon be reunited. To Carrie Pittersell, her husband and older children were establishing a new life in South America, where they would be safe from insurance investigators. The web of deception Holmes had woven was so complete that each family member trusted him absolutely while remaining ignorant of the other's true fate. The train journey to Cincinnati provided Holmes with an opportunity to study Howard's psychology and plan the boy's final hours in detail. Howard was different from his sisters. Where Alice and Nellie had shown increasing anxiety and suspicion during their final days, Howard remained trusting and optimistic, his childish faith in adults making him the perfect victim for Holmes's psychological experiments. The boy chattered excitedly about seeing his family again, describing his plans for their reunion and asking innocent questions about where they would live and what they would do together. Holmes encouraged these conversations, finding perverse pleasure in the child's excitement about a reunion that would never occur. Each hopeful comment from Howard provided Holmes with psychological satisfaction that exceeded even his anticipation of the murder itself. The complete trust and innocent affection the boy showed toward his future killer represented the ultimate validation of Holmes's manipulative abilities and his complete separation from human moral constraints. The house Holmes had rented in Irvington, a prosperous suburb of Indianapolis, was chosen specifically for Howard's murder. Unlike his elaborate Chicago facility with its specialized killing rooms and industrial disposal equipment, this was a simple two-story home that required Holmes to improvise his methods while maintaining the appearance of normalcy to neighbors and local authorities. The basement provided adequate space for body disposal, while the home's isolated location reduced the risk of screams being overheard during the murder process. Holmes spent 3 days with Howard in the Irvington house, using the time to conduct psychological experiments that would inform his future operations. He wanted to understand how a child's mind processed the transition from trust to terror, how long innocence could persist in the face of growing evidence of danger, and what psychological techniques were most effective for maintaining control over victims who had no reason to suspect their peril. The experiments began subtly. Holmes would tell Howard stories about children who'd been separated from their families, watching carefully for the boys' emotional responses and noting which themes produced the greatest anxiety. He introduced games that involved confinement and escape, testing Howard's reactions to being locked in small spaces while maintaining the pretense that these were merely entertainments to pass time until the family reunion. Most revealing were Holmes' questions about Howard's relationship with his deceased father and missing sisters. The boys' responses revealed the psychological mechanisms children use to cope with abandonment and uncertainty, providing Holmes with insights that could be applied to future child victims. Howard's desperate need to believe that his family was safe and that their separation was temporary made him vulnerable to manipulation techniques that Holmes catalogued for future reference. As the third day in Irvington dawned grey and cold, Holmes decided that his psychological experiments had yielded sufficient data and that Howard's murder could proceed. The method he chose reflected both practical constraints and his desire for psychological completion. Unlike his Chicago gas chambers or acid vats, Holmes would kill Howard using only his hands and simple tools, demonstrating his complete physical and psychological dominance over the child. The murder began with Holmes explaining to Howard that they were going to play a special game that would help him understand what had happened to his family. The boy's excitement at this prospect provided Holmes with the final psychological satisfaction he sought, complete trust maintained until the moment of betrayal. Holmes led Howard to the basement, describing the game as a test of courage that his father and sisters had also completed successfully. The trunk that Holmes had acquired for Howard's murder was an ordinary travelling case, unremarkable except for the modifications Holmes had made to ensure it would serve as an effective killing chamber. Ventilation holes had been reduced to prevent adequate airflow, while interior latches had been disabled to prevent escape. Holmes presented the trunk to Howard as a hiding place where he would wait for his family's arrival, explaining that surprises required secrecy and patience. Howard's entry into the trunk was voluntary, the boy's trust so complete that he followed Holmes's instructions without question. Even as Holmes began to close the lid, Howard's voice remained excited and hopeful, his final words expressing anticipation for the family reunion he believed was imminent. The psychological impact of this moment on Holmes was profound. He had achieved the ultimate expression of trust betrayed, innocence destroyed, and hope transformed into horror. The suffocation process that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Holmes listened through the trunk's walls to Howard's progression from confusion to panic to desperation. The boy's voice, initially calling for Holmes to let him out so the game could continue, gradually became weaker as oxygen levels decreased and carbon dioxide accumulated. Holmes documented the timeline carefully, noting physical symptoms and psychological responses that would inform future murders. Howard's final hour in the trunk provided Holmes with data that exceeded his expectations. The boy's desperate attempts to escape created sounds that Holmes found deeply satisfying, while his pleas for help revealed psychological insights about children's responses to abandonment and betrayal. When silence finally fell, Holmes felt a profound sense of completion. He had successfully murdered all 3 Petersel children using different methods, creating a comprehensive understanding of child killing that no other criminal could match. The disposal of Howard's body required improvised techniques that demonstrated both Holmes's expertise and the limitations of operating without his Chicago facility. The basement's concrete floor had to be broken up to create a burial space, work that Holmes conducted over several nights to avoid attracting attention from neighbours. The body was dismembered using surgical tools Holmes carried in his travelling kit, the pieces wrapped in canvas and buried in separate locations throughout the basement. Unlike his Chicago operations, where corpse processing generated profitable anatomical specimens, Howard's murder was purely consumptive. The boy's death served only Holmes's psychological needs and operational security requirements. The absence of commercial benefits from the murder reflected Holmes's evolution from profit-motivated killing to murder for its own psychological rewards. The psychological aftermath of Howard's murder revealed changes in Holmes that he found both disturbing and exhilarating. The systematic elimination of the Petersel children had pushed his empathy levels to absolute zero, while demonstrating that no relationship, no matter how trust-based or apparently affectionate, could protect potential victims from his predatory calculations. Holmes had achieved complete psychological separation from human moral constraints, becoming a creature of pure predatory instinct. But Howard's murder also marked the beginning of Holmes's operational decline. Unlike his Chicago killings, which were conducted in facilities designed for efficient body disposal and evidence elimination, the Indianapolis murder left substantial physical evidence that careful investigation could discover. The rental of the Irvington house was documented, neighbors had seen Holmes with Howard, and the boy's burial in the basement created remains that could be recovered and identified. More significantly, Howard's murder completed a pattern of disappearances that Detective Frank Geyer was beginning to reconstruct through methodical investigation. The deaths of Benjamin Pitezel and the disappearances of his children created a trail of evidence that Geyer's systematic approach was gradually uncovering. Each forged document, each false identity, and each suspicious death added another piece to a puzzle that was becoming increasingly clear. As Holmes departed Indianapolis on November 1, 1894, leaving Howard's remains buried in the Irvington basement, he carried with him the satisfaction of having completed his most ambitious murder scheme, while gaining unprecedented insights into the psychology of systematic child killing. But he also carried the seeds of his own destruction, evidence that would eventually allow investigators to reconstruct his crimes and build an overwhelming case against him. The children's last journey had ended in the basement of a suburban house, their bodies buried beneath concrete while their killer moved on to new hunting grounds. But their deaths had created a trail of evidence that would eventually lead to Holmes's capture, trial, and execution. The predator's greatest triumph would ultimately become the source of his downfall. Standing on the platform of Union Station as his train prepared to depart for Boston, Holmes reflected on what he had accomplished in his systematic elimination of the Pitezel family. He had demonstrated that entire families could be murdered while maintaining the trust and cooperation of the victims, that children could be killed using techniques that provided maximum psychological satisfaction, and that bodies could be disposed of using improvised methods when industrial facilities weren't available. But as the train pulled away from Indianapolis, carrying Holmes toward what he believed would be new opportunities for killing and fraud, he was unaware that Detective Frank Geyer was already following his trail, reconstructing his movements, and building the case that would end his career as America's first systematic serial killer. The children's last journey was complete, but Holmes's own journey toward justice had just begun. Chapter 11. The Web Unravels. Late 1894. Detective Frank Geyer stood in the cramped records office of the Fidelity Mutual Life Association in Philadelphia, surrounded by towers of insurance files that seemed to mock him with their bureaucratic complexity. It was December 15th, 1894, and Geyer had been pursuing the trail of H. Holmes for 8 months, following a web of deception that stretched across multiple states and involved dozens of false identities, forged documents, and suspicious deaths. What had begun as a routine investigation into Benjamin Pitezel's insurance claim had evolved into something that challenged Geyer's understanding of criminal behavior. The methodical detective, known throughout Philadelphia for his ability to solve cases that others abandoned as hopeless, found himself confronting evidence of systematic murder on a scale that no American law enforcement officer had ever encountered. Geyer's investigation had revealed that Holmes operated with a sophistication that surpassed any criminal the detective had previously pursued. Unlike typical murderers who acted impulsively and left obvious evidence, Holmes planned his crimes with scientific precision, created elaborate cover stories that could withstand casual scrutiny, and maintained multiple identities that allowed him to operate across state lines without detection. The breakthrough in Geyer's investigation came through his discovery of Holmes's correspondence with various insurance companies, letters that revealed a pattern of suspicious claims involving policies purchased shortly before the insured parties' deaths. But it was Holmes' relationship with the Pitezel family that provided Geyer with the thread he needed to unravel the entire conspiracy. Carrie Pitezel's interviews with Geyer had been heartbreaking in their revelation of complete psychological manipulation. The widow trusted Holmes absolutely, believing his explanations for her husband's death and her children's prolonged absence from home. Holmes had convinced her that Benjamin was alive but in hiding, that Alice and Nellie were safe in a boarding school, and that Howard was living with relatives who would care for him until the family could be reunited. But Geyer's methodical nature led him to question every element of Holmes's story. and his investigation revealed contradictions that proved Holmes was lying about fundamental facts. Hotel registration records showed that Alice and Nellie had never arrived at the boarding school Holmes claimed they attended. Railway ticket stubs indicated that Howard had travelled to Indianapolis with Holmes but had never returned. Most damning of all, witnesses in multiple cities had seen Holmes with the children just before their disappearances. Guyer's investigation techniques reflected the emerging science of criminal detection that would eventually evolve into modern forensic methods. He maintained detailed charts tracking Holmes's movements across multiple states, correlated hotel registration records with railway schedules to verify travel claims, and interviewed hundreds of witnesses to establish reliable timelines for Holmes's activities. The detective's pursuit of Holmes took him to Toronto, where local police had been investigating the disappearance of two American girls who matched Alice and Nellie Pitterzel's descriptions. The investigation had stalled due to lack of leads, but Guyer's information about Holmes's presence in the city during the relevant time period provided the breakthrough Canadian authorities needed. The discovery of the Pitterzel girls' bodies in the basement of the St. Vincent Street house in Toronto marked a turning point in Guyer's investigation. The remains provided physical evidence that Holmes had murdered children, while the circumstances of their deaths revealed a level of cruelty that shocked even experienced investigators. The girls had been tortured before being killed, their bodies showing evidence of systematic abuse that demonstrated Holmes's complete lack of human empathy. But the Toronto discovery also revealed Holmes's growing carelessness and overconfidence. Unlike his Chicago operations, and where bodies were processed through sophisticated disposal systems that left no trace, the Toronto murders had been conducted hastily and without adequate preparation. The house rental was documented, neighbours had seen Holmes with the children, and the burial site could be discovered through systematic investigation. Guyer's reconstruction of the Pitterzel children's final journey demonstrated detective work of unprecedented sophistication. Using railway records, hotel registrations, and witness testimonies, he traced Holmes's movements across multiple states, while maintaining custody of children he was systematically murdering. The timeline Guyer developed showed that Holmes had kept Alice and Nellie separated from Howard, while feeding each elaborate lies about the other's whereabouts. The search for Howard Pitterzel's remains led Guyer to Indianapolis, where local authorities had been unaware that a child murder had occurred in their jurisdiction. Guyer's information about Holmes's rental of the Irvington house provided investigators with a specific location to search. An excavation of the basement revealed Howard's dismembered remains buried beneath the concrete floor. The discovery of Howard's body completed Guyer's reconstruction of Holmes' systematic elimination of the Pitterzel family. The detective's evidence showed that Holmes had murdered Benjamin to collect insurance benefits, then used the surviving family members as cover for his escape from Chicago, while gradually killing each of them to prevent testimony about his crimes. But Guyer's investigation also revealed that the Pitterzel murders were only the most recent elements in a criminal career that stretched back years and included dozens of additional victims. And insurance records showed a pattern of suspicious deaths involving people who had business relationships with Holmes, while missing person reports from Chicago suggested that numerous World's Fair visitors had disappeared after checking into Holmes's hotel. The scope of Holmes's criminal activities challenged law enforcement agencies that were accustomed to dealing with individual crimes rather than systematic murder schemes that crossed state boundaries. Guyer found himself coordinating with police departments in Illinois, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and Canada, sharing information about a criminal whose operations exceeded anything in American law enforcement experience. Holmes's network of accomplices and corrupt officials also came to light during Guyer's investigation. The detective discovered that Holmes had bribed insurance company employees to expedite claims processing, paid officials to falsify death certificates, and maintained relationships with criminal associates who helped dispose of evidence and create false identities. The financial scope of Holmes's crimes was equally staggering. Guyer's accounting revealed that Holmes had collected over $200,000 in fraudulent insurance claims while operating businesses that generated substantial legitimate revenue. The combination of murder for profit and systematic fraud had created a criminal enterprise that operated on a scale previously unknown in American crime. Guyer's investigation also uncovered evidence of Holmes's Chicago operations, though the destruction of the building and elimination of witnesses made reconstruction difficult. Insurance investigators who had been pursuing separate cases involving Holmes's hotel guests began sharing information with Geyer, revealing a pattern of disappearances that suggested dozens of additional murders. The psychological profile that emerged from Geyer's investigation portrayed Holmes as a criminal unlike any previously encountered by American law enforcement. Unlike typical murderers who killed in moments of passion or desperation, Holmes approached murder as a business proposition, calculating costs and benefits with the same analytical approach he might apply to any commercial venture. Holmes' ability to maintain multiple identities and personas while conducting systematic murder demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication that challenged conventional understanding of criminal behavior. Witnesses consistently described him as charming, cultured, and trustworthy, qualities that made his victims comfortable while concealing his predatory nature. The legal challenges presented by Holmes's crimes also exceeded anything in American jurisprudence. His activities crossed multiple state boundaries, involved both state and federal crimes, and included evidence that required coordination between agencies that had no established procedures for such cooperation. Prosecutors faced the challenge of building cases based on evidence scattered across multiple jurisdictions while dealing with a defendant who possessed sophisticated knowledge of legal procedures. As 1894 drew to a close, Geyer's investigation had transformed from a routine insurance fraud case into the most complex criminal investigation in American history. The detective had uncovered evidence of systematic murder on an unprecedented scale, documented criminal activities that spanned multiple states and involved dozens of victims, and identified a criminal whose sophistication exceeded anything in law enforcement experience. But Geyer's most significant achievement was proving that systematic criminal investigation could succeed against even the most sophisticated criminals. His methodical approach, attention to detail, and refusal to accept convenient explanations had unraveled a conspiracy that Holmes believed was impenetrable. The predator who had considered himself untouchable was about to discover that justice, while sometimes slow, could be relentless in its pursuit. Standing in his Philadelphia office as snow fell outside, Geyer reviewed the evidence he had assembled against Holmes. The case files filled multiple cabinets and included testimony from hundreds of witnesses, but the detective knew that his work was entering its final phase. Holmes had been arrested in Boston on insurance fraud charges, and it was time to build the criminal case that would bring America's first systematic serial killer to justice. The web had been unraveled, the evidence assembled, and the trap prepared. All that remained was to close it around the monster who had terrorized America while hiding behind a mask of respectability and charm. Chapter 12. Capture of the Devil. November 1894. The Tremont House in Boston stood as a monument to Gilded Age prosperity, its ornate lobby bustling with the refined energy of America's intellectual capital. Among the guests checking in on the foggy evening of November 17, 1894, few would have recognized the distinguished gentleman who signed the register as H.M. Howard, a man whose real identity was becoming the subject of the most intensive manhunt in American law enforcement history. H. Holmes had arrived in Boston believing himself to be beyond the reach of the investigators who were gradually unraveling his criminal empire. The distance from Chicago and Philadelphia, combined with his latest false identity, should have provided the security he needed to plan his next ventures. But Holmes was about to discover that his reputation for criminal sophistication had been matched by the methodical determination of Detective Frank Geyer and the network of law enforcement officers who were closing in on their prey. The arrest came with shocking suddenness on the morning of November the 20th. Holmes was reading the morning paper in the hotel's dining room, enjoying coffee and planning his day's activities, when Detective Geyer and 3 Boston police officers approached his table. The contrast between Holmes's calm, civilized breakfast and the violent reality of his criminal career created a moment of surreal tension that observers would remember for decades. "Dr. Holmes," Geyer said quietly, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his quarry, "you're under arrest for insurance fraud and suspicion of murder." Holmes's reaction revealed both his psychological sophistication and his complete lack of preparation for this moment. Rather than denying his identity or attempting to flee, he smiled with genuine appreciation for Geyer's detective work and extended his hand as if greeting an old friend. "Detective Geyer." "I presume," Holmes said, his charm undimmed even in the face of arrest. I must congratulate you on your persistence. I had begun to think that American law enforcement lacked the intellectual capacity to pursue a case of this complexity. The exchange between Holmes and Geyer in those first moments of arrest encapsulated the psychological dynamics that had driven their months-long cat-and-mouse game. Holmes possessed the arrogance of a criminal who believed his intelligence made him untouchable, while Geyer embodied the methodical determination of justice pursued through systematic investigation. The arrest itself proceeded without violence or drama, Holmes submitting to handcuffs with the same casual dignity he might display when putting on evening gloves. But his compliance masked a calculating mind that was already working on escape plans, legal strategies, and psychological manipulations that might yet allow him to evade the consequences of his crimes. The Boston jail where Holmes was initially held provided him with his first taste of confinement since his criminal career began. But even behind bars, his charismatic personality allowed him to establish relationships with guards and fellow prisoners that he might exploit for future advantage. Within days of his arrest, Holmes had charmed his way into receiving special privileges and accommodations that other inmates were denied. But Holmes's most significant activity during his initial confinement was his decision to begin writing what he described as his autobiography, a document that would serve multiple purposes in his strategy for survival. The manuscript would allow him to control the narrative of his crimes while positioning himself as a misunderstood genius rather than a common murderer. More importantly, it would provide him with leverage for plea negotiations and potential appeals. Holmes's autobiography represented a masterpiece of psychological manipulation disguised as confession. Rather than accepting responsibility for his crimes, he portrayed himself as a victim of uncontrollable impulses, a brilliant mind corrupted by forces beyond his comprehension. The document blamed his criminal behavior on everything from childhood trauma to medical school experiences to the corrupting influence of modern urban life. The psychological insights revealed in Holmes's writing demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of human nature and his complete lack of genuine remorse for his actions. He described his victims not as human beings whose lives he had destroyed, but as subjects in scientific experiments that had contributed to his understanding of psychology and physiology. The murders were presented as regrettable necessities rather than acts of evil, while his torture methods were described as research techniques that had advanced human knowledge. The legal proceedings surrounding Holmes' case revealed the limitations of American criminal justice when confronted with crimes that exceeded all previous experience. Prosecutors faced the challenge of building cases based on evidence scattered across multiple states, while dealing with a defendant who possessed sophisticated knowledge of legal procedures and seemed to enjoy the intellectual challenge of courtroom combat. Holmes's decision to represent himself in court reflected both his arrogance and his belief that his charm and intelligence could succeed where conventional legal defense might fail. His performance during preliminary hearings demonstrated remarkable courtroom skills, as he cross-examined witnesses with the precision of an experienced attorney while maintaining the dignified demeanour of a wrongly accused gentleman. But Holmes's legal strategy also revealed the psychological compulsions that had driven his criminal career. Rather than focusing on technical defences that might create reasonable doubt, he seemed determined to demonstrate his intellectual superiority over prosecutors, judges, and witnesses. His cross-examinations became elaborate displays of his knowledge and charm, rather than effective legal tactics. The media attention surrounding Holmes's arrest and initial court appearances transformed him into America's first celebrity criminal, with newspapers across the country competing to provide the most sensational coverage of his alleged crimes. The contrast between his cultured appearance and the horrific nature of his alleged activities created a public fascination that exceeded anything in American criminal history. Holmes clearly enjoyed the attention, granting interviews to reporters and providing quotable observations about the American legal system, the psychology of crime, and his own motivations. These interviews revealed a man who seemed to view his criminal trial as an intellectual exercise rather than a proceeding that might result in his execution. The evidence that Geyer and other investigators had assembled against Holmes created an overwhelming case that challenged even Holmes's considerable skills at manipulation and deception. Insurance records documented systematic fraud involving dozens of policies. Witness testimonies placed Holmes at the scenes of multiple murders, and physical evidence from crime scenes provided conclusive proof of his guilt. But perhaps the most damaging evidence against Holmes came from his own writings and statements, which revealed a man who possessed detailed knowledge of crimes that only the perpetrator could know. His autobiography contained information about victim selection methods, murder techniques, and body disposal procedures that could only have come from direct experience. The psychological evaluation of Holmes conducted during his confinement provided insights into a criminal mind unlike any previously studied by American alienists. The examining physicians found Holmes to be completely sane by legal standards, while noting his complete lack of empathy, his grandiose self-image, and his ability to manipulate others through carefully calculated charm. Holmes's interactions with fellow inmates also revealed his predatory nature and his inability to form genuine human relationships. Even in jail, he attempted to recruit accomplices for future schemes, traded information about criminal techniques, and maintained the psychological distance from other human beings that had characterized his entire adult life. The legal complications surrounding Holmes's case reflected the reality that American law enforcement in the 1890s was unprepared to deal with crimes that crossed state boundaries and involved multiple jurisdictions. Questions arose about which courts had jurisdiction, which charges should take precedence, and how evidence from different states could be coordinated into coherent prosecutions. Holmes attempted to exploit these complications by demanding separate trials in each jurisdiction, hoping to create conflicts between prosecutors that might allow him to escape conviction in at least some cases. His strategy reflected his understanding of legal technicalities and his belief that the American justice system could be manipulated through superior intelligence and careful planning. But Detective Geyer's methodical investigation had anticipated these legal challenges and prepared responses that would ensure Holmes faced justice regardless of jurisdictional complications. The evidence Geyer had assembled was so comprehensive and well documented that it could support prosecutions in multiple states while maintaining the consistency necessary for successful convictions. As winter settled over Boston and Holmes' legal proceedings moved toward trial, the man who had once considered himself America's most sophisticated criminal began to realize that his capture represented more than a temporary setback. The evidence against him was overwhelming, his legal strategies were failing, and his charm was proving ineffective against prosecutors who understood the true nature of his crimes. Standing in his jail cell as snow fell outside, Holmes faced the reality that his career as America's first systematic serial killer was ending. The devil had been captured, and justice was preparing to exact its price for the dozens of lives he had destroyed in his pursuit of profit, pleasure, and psychological satisfaction. The capture had been completed, but the reckoning was just beginning. Chapter 13. Confessions of a Monster. 1895. The Moyamensing prison in Philadelphia stood like a Gothic fortress against the grey winter sky. Its fortress-like walls containing some of America's most dangerous criminals behind bars that had never before held anyone quite like Herman Webster Mudgett. In cell block D, the man known to the world as Dr. H. Holmes sat at a small wooden desk, his handwriting flowing across page after page of what would become the most disturbing confession in American criminal history. The year 1895 had begun with Holmes facing the reality that his capture represented more than a temporary inconvenience. It was the end of a criminal career that had redefined the possibilities for systematic murder in modern America. But rather than accepting defeat with dignified silence, Holmes had chosen to transform even his confession into an opportunity for psychological manipulation and self-aggrandizement. The document Holmes produced during his months of pretrial confinement was titled Holmes' Own Story, and represented a masterpiece of criminal narcissism disguised as remorseful autobiography. Rather than simply admitting to specific crimes, Holmes crafted a narrative that portrayed him as a tragic figure whose brilliant mind had been corrupted by forces beyond his control. The confession served multiple purposes. It allowed Holmes to maintain some control over his public image while providing prosecutors with evidence they needed for successful conviction. Holmes's approach to confession revealed the same calculating intelligence that had made his murder spree possible. Rather than providing a straightforward account of his crimes, he created a psychological puzzle that mixed genuine admissions with obvious fabrications, forcing readers to distinguish between truth and manipulation. The document demonstrated Holmes's belief that he could maintain intellectual superiority even while facing execution for his crimes. The initial pages of Holmes' confession focused on his childhood and medical school experiences, painting a picture of a young man whose natural intelligence and curiosity had been corrupted by exposure to death and human anatomy. Holmes described his early fascination with corpses and dissection as scientific interest rather than morbid obsession, positioning himself as a misunderstood researcher rather than a predatory killer. But as the confession progressed, Holmes began revealing details about his crimes that only the perpetrator could know. His descriptions of victim selection methods, murder techniques, and body disposal procedures provided prosecutors with evidence that would prove invaluable in court while demonstrating Holmes' complete lack of genuine remorse for his actions. Holmes's account of his Chicago operations during the World's Fair represented the most chilling section of his confession. He described his murder castle not as a facility designed for systematic killing, but as an innovative business venture that happened to include murder as one of its revenue streams. The gas chambers, acid vats, and crematorium were presented as practical solutions to business problems, rather than instruments of torture and death. The confession's treatment of individual victims revealed Holmes' complete dehumanization of the people he had killed. Rather than acknowledging them as individuals with families, dreams, and inherent worth, Holmes described his victims as raw materials for his various experiments and business ventures. Julia Smythe was presented as an employee whose usefulness had expired, while Pearl Smythe was described as a research subject who had contributed valuable data about child psychology under extreme stress. Holmes' description of the Pittersall family murders demonstrated both his psychological sophistication and his complete lack of empathy for human suffering. He explained his systematic elimination of Benjamin Pittersall and the children as necessary steps in a complex insurance fraud scheme, showing no recognition that he had destroyed an entire family for financial gain. The murders were presented as business decisions rather than acts of evil. The confession also revealed Holmes' grandiose self-image and his belief that his crimes represented achievements worthy of admiration rather than condemnation. He described his techniques with the pride of a craftsman discussing his finest work, providing detailed explanations of murder methods and disposal procedures as if he were contributing to scientific knowledge rather than documenting acts of systematic evil. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Holmes's confession was his attempt to manipulate readers' sympathy by portraying himself as a victim of uncontrollable compulsions. He claimed that he was unable to resist the urge to kill, describing murder as an addiction that he regretted but could not overcome. This psychological manipulation was designed to create the impression that Holmes was mentally ill rather than simply evil, potentially providing grounds for an insanity defense. Holmes's mathematical approach to confession was particularly revealing of his calculating nature. He provided precise counts of his victims, claiming to have killed exactly 27 people, while offering detailed financial accounting of the profits generated by each murder. The confession treated systematic killing as a business venture that could be evaluated using conventional metrics of success and profitability. The document's treatment of Holmes' accomplices and associates revealed his willingness to betray anyone who had assisted him in his crimes. He provided detailed information about Benjamin Pittersall's role in the insurance schemes while accepting no responsibility for corrupting Pittersall or leading him into criminal activity. Julia Smythe was described as a willing participant in murder rather than a victim of psychological manipulation who had been coerced into compliance. Holmes's confession also demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of legal procedures and his attempt to control the prosecution's case by providing selective admissions while withholding information that might be most damaging. He admitted to murders where the evidence was already overwhelming while remaining vague about crimes where successful prosecution might be more difficult. The psychological insights revealed in Holmes' writing provided alienists and legal experts with unprecedented data about the criminal mind, but they also served Holmes's strategic purposes by positioning him as a unique case worthy of special consideration rather than simple execution. He presented himself as a criminal whose sophistication exceeded conventional categories, someone whose case might contribute to scientific understanding of abnormal psychology. Holmes's descriptions of his victims' final moments revealed both his complete lack of empathy and his detailed memory of events that most people would find too traumatic to recall clearly. He provided precise accounts of murder timelines, victim responses to torture, and the efficiency of different killing methods, treating human suffering as a research data rather than moral tragedy. The confession's treatment of Holmes' emotional responses to killing demonstrated his complete separation from normal human moral constraints. Rather than describing guilt, remorse, or psychological trauma resulting from his murders, Holmes wrote about the satisfaction and intellectual stimulation he derived from successfully completing complex criminal schemes. Murder was presented as a problem-solving exercise that provided both practical benefits and psychological rewards. Holmes's account of his basement operations revealed the industrial scale of his murder enterprise, while demonstrating his pride in the efficiency and profitability of his systems. He described his corpse processing facility with the same attention to detail that a legitimate businessman might use to explain manufacturing procedures, showing no recognition that he was describing systematic desecration of human remains. The confession also revealed Holmes's belief that his crimes represented evolutionary advancement rather than moral regression. He positioned himself as a superior being whose intelligence and lack of emotional constraints made him naturally dominant over conventional humans. The murders were presented as expressions of natural selection rather than violations of moral law. As Holmes continued writing throughout the spring of 1895, his confession evolved from strategic document into psychological manifesto that revealed the true nature of America's first systematic serial killer. The man who had charmed dozens of victims to their deaths was using his final months of freedom to demonstrate that his manipulative abilities remained intact, even while facing execution. The completed confession would serve as crucial evidence in Holmes's trial, while providing future criminologists with unprecedented insights into the psychology of systematic murder. But for Holmes, the document represented something more significant, a final demonstration of his intellectual superiority and his refusal to accept conventional moral judgment of his actions. Standing at his cell window as spring arrived in Philadelphia, Holmes reflected on what he had accomplished through his confession. He had created a document that would ensure his place in criminal history, while potentially providing legal advantages in his upcoming trial. Most importantly, he had maintained control over his narrative even while facing the ultimate consequences of his crimes. The confessions were complete, but the monster who had written them remained unrepentant and convinced of his own superiority. The final chapter of Holmes's story was about to be written in a Philadelphia courtroom, where his charm and intelligence would face the ultimate test against American justice. Chapter 14, Trial of the Century. 1895. The Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas had never witnessed anything comparable to the scene that unfolded on the morning of October 28, 1895, as hundreds of spectators crowded into the courthouse, hoping to catch a glimpse of America's most notorious criminal. The trial of H. Holmes for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel had captured the nation's imagination, with newspapers across the country providing daily coverage of proceedings that promised to reveal the full scope of systematic murder on an unprecedented scale. Holmes entered the courtroom with the same dignified bearing that had charmed victims to their deaths, his appearance immaculate despite months of confinement, and his demeanour suggesting confidence rather than concern about the outcome of his trial. The decision to represent himself had surprised legal observers who expected him to rely on experienced criminal attorneys, but Holmes viewed the trial as an intellectual challenge that would demonstrate his superiority over the legal system that sought to condemn him. District Attorney George Graham faced the complex challenge of prosecuting a case that involved evidence from multiple states, dozens of potential witnesses, and a defendant whose sophistication exceeded anything in American criminal jurisprudence. The prosecution's strategy focused on the murder of Benjamin Pitezel, using that crime as the foundation for a case that would reveal the systematic nature of Holmes' criminal enterprise without becoming lost in the overwhelming scope of his activities. The opening statements revealed the fundamental contrast between prosecution and defense approaches to Holmes's case. Graham portrayed Holmes as a calculating killer who had murdered Benjamin Pitezel for insurance money while systematically eliminating witnesses to prevent discovery of his crimes. Holmes, representing himself, presented a narrative that acknowledged his involvement in insurance fraud while denying intentional murder, claiming that Pitezel's death had been an accident during a staged explosion designed to defraud insurance companies. Holmes's performance as his own attorney demonstrated both his considerable intelligence and his complete lack of genuine understanding of his position. His cross-examinations of prosecution witnesses revealed sophisticated knowledge of legal procedures and impressive skills at identifying weaknesses in testimony. But his questioning also revealed his narcissistic personality and his belief that charm and intelligence could overcome overwhelming evidence of guilt. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Detective Frank Geyer's methodical investigation, which had traced Holmes' movements across multiple states while documenting his systematic elimination of the Pittersell family. Geyer's testimony provided the court with a comprehensive timeline of Holmes's activities, supported by hotel registration records, railway tickets, and witness statements that proved Holmes had been present at each crime scene. But the trial's most dramatic moments came when Holmes took the witness stand in his own defense, providing spectators with their first opportunity to hear America's most notorious criminal explain his actions in his own words. Holmes's testimony revealed a man who possessed remarkable self-control and sophisticated understanding of human psychology, but who seemed incapable of recognizing the moral significance of his crimes. Holmes's explanation of his relationship with Benjamin Pettersell demonstrated his manipulative abilities and his complete lack of genuine emotion. He described Pettersell as a willing partner in insurance fraud schemes while expressing apparent regret for the accident that had caused his death. But Holmes's testimony also revealed details about their criminal partnership that only strengthened the prosecution's case, as he provided information that proved his intimate knowledge of crimes he claimed to have committed accidentally. The defendant's cross-examination of Carrie Pettersell, Benjamin's widow, provided the trial's most emotionally powerful moments, while revealing Holmes' complete lack of empathy for human suffering. Holmes questioned the grieving widow about her husband's criminal activities and her children's disappearances with the same clinical detachment he might apply to a scientific experiment, showing no recognition of the pain his questions caused or the horror of the crimes being discussed. Holmes's treatment of evidence related to the murdered Pettersell children revealed both his psychological sophistication and his fundamental inability to understand conventional moral responses to his crimes. Rather than expressing remorse for killing Alice, Nellie, and Howard, Holmes focused on technical details of the evidence while challenging the prosecution's timeline and methods. His questions about the children's remains were conducted with the same analytical approach he had applied to their murders. The prosecution's presentation of physical evidence from Holmes's Chicago operations created some of the trial's most disturbing moments, as investigators described the murder castle's killing rooms, acid vats, and corpse processing facilities. Holmes's response to this evidence revealed his pride in his criminal innovations rather than shame about their purpose, as he corrected technical details in witness testimony and provided additional information about his methods. Holmes's closing argument represented perhaps the most extraordinary moment in American criminal trial history. As the defendant attempted to convince jurors that his intelligence and charm made him worthy of mercy, despite overwhelming evidence of systematic murder, his speech demonstrated remarkable oratorical skills and sophisticated understanding of legal arguments, but it also revealed his fundamental inability to comprehend the moral significance of his actions. The jury's deliberation lasted less than 3 hours, reflecting the overwhelming nature of the evidence against Holmes despite his impressive performance as his own attorney. The speed of their decision suggested that Holmes's charm and intelligence had failed to overcome the horror of his crimes, as jurors focused on the evidence rather than the personality of the defendant who presented it. The verdict of guilty of first-degree murder came as no surprise to legal observers who had followed the trial, but Holmes's reaction revealed his continued belief that his intellectual superiority should protect him from conventional consequences. Rather than showing remorse or accepting responsibility for his crimes, Holmes immediately began planning appeals that would demonstrate additional aspects of his legal knowledge and manipulative abilities. Judge Michael Arnold's sentencing of Holmes to death by hanging provided the trial's final dramatic moment, as America's most notorious criminal received the ultimate punishment for crimes that had redefined the possibilities for systematic evil. Holmes's response to his death sentence revealed the same calculating intelligence that had made his murder spree possible, as he began immediately planning legal strategies that might yet allow him to escape execution. The trial's conclusion left spectators and legal observers with profound questions about the nature of evil and the capacity of the American justice system to deal with crimes that exceeded all previous experience, Holmes had demonstrated that systematic murder could be conducted with industrial efficiency while maintaining perfect social respectability, challenging conventional assumptions about criminal behavior and moral responsibility. The media coverage of Holmes' trial had transformed him into America's first celebrity criminal, with newspapers providing detailed coverage that satisfied public fascination while potentially inspiring future criminals who might seek similar notoriety. The trial's revelations about Holmes's methods and techniques had inadvertently provided a blueprint for systematic murder that law enforcement agencies worried might be copied by other criminals. Holmes's performance during his trial had also revealed disturbing insights about the relationship between intelligence and morality, as he had demonstrated that sophisticated education and cultural refinement could coexist with complete absence of human empathy. The charming, articulate defendant who had impressed spectators with his legal skills was the same man who had tortured children for psychological satisfaction and processed human corpses for commercial profit. As Holmes was led from the courtroom to await execution, he carried with him the satisfaction of having provided America with its most sensational criminal trial while maintaining his intellectual pride despite his legal defeat. The trial was over, but Holmes's influence on American criminal justice and popular culture was just beginning. The trial of the century had concluded with justice served, but the questions it raised about human nature, criminal psychology, and the capacity for evil would continue to resonate long after Holmes met his fate on the gallows. America had confronted its first systematic serial killer and found him guilty, but the experience had revealed disturbing truths about the potential for sophisticated evil that would influence law enforcement and criminal justice for generations to come. Chapter 15. The Devil's Due, May 7th, 1896. The morning of May 7th, 1896, dawned clear and cool over Philadelphia, carrying with it the promise of spring renewal and the grim certainty of justice finally served. In the Moyamensing prison, Herman Webster Mudgett, the man the world knew as H. Holmes, awakened for the final time in the cell that had housed him for over a year, his execution scheduled for 10:12 a.m. with the mechanical precision that had characterized his own systematic murders. Holmes had spent the night before his execution in activities that revealed both his intellectual arrogance and his complete lack of genuine remorse for the dozens of lives he had destroyed. Rather than praying, reflecting on his victims, or expressing regret for his crimes, Holmes had devoted his final hours to writing additional letters that demonstrated his continued belief in his own superiority and his conviction that history would vindicate his actions as the work of a misunderstood genius. The letters Holmes wrote during his final night revealed a man who remained psychologically unchanged despite facing the ultimate consequences of his actions. He continued to describe his victims as subjects in scientific experiments rather than human beings whose lives he had destroyed, referring to his murder castle as an innovative business venture rather than a facility designed for systematic torture and death. Even facing execution, Holmes maintained the psychological distance from conventional morality that had made his crimes possible. Holmes's final interview with a reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer, conducted just hours before his execution, provided America with its last glimpse of the calculating mind that had redefined the possibilities for systematic evil. The condemned man discussed his crimes with the same analytical detachment he might apply to any business venture, providing statistical analysis of his murder techniques, while showing no recognition of the moral significance of his actions. "I have been forced to do what I have done," Holmes told the reporter, his voice steady and his demeanour unchanged despite the approaching gallows. "I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing. The inclination came to me as naturally as the breath of life." This final statement encapsulated Holmes' complete separation from human moral constraints and his fundamental inability to accept responsibility for his choices. Even in his last hours, he portrayed himself as a victim of forces beyond his control rather than as a predator who had systematically destroyed human lives for profit and psychological satisfaction. The execution preparations revealed the careful attention to detail that authorities had applied to ensure Holmes's death proceeded without the complications that had marked his criminal career. The gallows had been tested repeatedly, the rope inspected for proper strength and length, and security measures implemented to prevent any possibility of escape or rescue attempts. Pennsylvania was determined that America's most notorious criminal would finally face the consequences his victims had been denied. Holmes's walk to the gallows demonstrated the same composure and dignity that had characterized his public appearances throughout his criminal career and subsequent trial. He moved with steady steps, his back straight and his expression calm, providing no satisfaction to the witnesses who hoped to see him display fear or remorse. Even facing death, Holmes maintained the mask of respectability that had allowed him to kill with impunity for years. The small crowd of official witnesses assembled to observe Holmes' execution included law enforcement officers who had investigated his crimes, court officials who had prosecuted his case, and newspaper reporters who would document America's final reckoning with its first systematic serial killer. Notably absent were family members of Holmes's victims, most of whom remained unidentified and unmourned due to his systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses. Prison chaplain Henry Tuttle's attempt to provide Holmes with final spiritual comfort revealed the condemned man's complete rejection of conventional moral and religious frameworks. When Tuttle asked Holmes if he wished to confess his sins and seek forgiveness, Holmes replied that he had already provided all the confession necessary through his autobiography and saw no need for additional spiritual exercises. "I am prepared to meet whatever comes," Holmes stated, his voice carrying the same confidence that had characterized his criminal activities. "I have lived according to my nature, and I will die according to my principles." The positioning of the noose around Holmes's neck marked the final moment in a criminal career that had lasted over a decade and claimed dozens of lives across multiple states. The executioner's hood, black silk that concealed Holmes' features for the first time since his public career began, seemed symbolically appropriate for a man who had hidden his true nature behind masks of charm and respectability. Holmes's final words, spoken just moments before the trapdoor opened, provided America with a lasting image of unrepentant evil facing its inevitable consequences. "I have very little to say. I am prepared to die. I wish you all good luck." The execution itself proceeded with mechanical efficiency that Holmes himself might have admired. The trapdoor opening at precisely 10:12 a.m. and Holmes's body dropping through space toward the death that had awaited him since his first murder years earlier. But the drop was miscalculated, and Holmes's death was neither quick nor clean. His neck did not break as intended, and he slowly strangled over a period of several minutes, his body twisting and jerking as life gradually left him. The irony of Holmes' prolonged death was not lost on witnesses who knew the details of his crimes. The man who had subjected dozens of victims to extended torture and slow death was experiencing something similar himself, though his suffering lasted minutes rather than the hours or days he had inflicted on others. Justice, it seemed, had delivered a form of poetic retribution that exceeded human planning. Dr. William Scott's examination of Holmes's body confirmed his death at 10:25 a.m., officially ending the criminal career of America's most notorious murderer. But even in death, Holmes had arranged for one final manipulation of public attention. His will specified that his body should be buried in concrete 10 feet deep to prevent grave robbing and ensure that his remains could never be used for the same commercial purposes he had applied to his victims' corpses. The burial of Holmes's body in Philadelphia's Holy Cross Cemetery took place under heavy security, with authorities concerned that souvenir hunters or morbid curiosity seekers might attempt to disturb his grave. The concrete vault that enclosed his coffin represented Holmes' final attempt to control events from beyond death, ensuring that his physical remains would be preserved while his intellectual legacy continued to influence American criminal justice. The immediate aftermath of Holmes' execution revealed the profound impact his crimes had on American society and law enforcement. Police departments across the country began implementing new procedures for investigating missing persons cases, insurance companies revised their policies for detecting fraudulent claims, and medical schools established stricter controls over anatomical specimen procurement to prevent future criminals from exploiting legitimate scientific needs. But Holmes's most significant legacy lay in his demonstration that systematic murder could be conducted with industrial efficiency by criminals who possessed sufficient intelligence, planning ability, and complete absence of moral constraints. His techniques and methods would influence criminal investigators for generations, while potentially inspiring future predators who might seek to emulate or exceed his achievements. The destruction of Holmes' murder castle, which had occurred while he awaited trial, eliminated the physical evidence of his most elaborate crimes, but could not erase the psychological impact of his innovations in systematic killing. The building's demolition had been conducted with unusual thoroughness, as if authorities hoped to purge the very ground of contamination from Holmes's presence. The insurance industry's response to Holmes's fraud schemes resulted in fundamental changes to claim investigation procedures and intercompany communication that would prevent future criminals from exploiting systemic weaknesses. But these improvements came at the cost of dozens of lives and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent payments that Holmes had collected through his sophisticated schemes. Detective Frank Geyer's investigation of Holmes's crimes had established new standards for criminal investigation that would influence law enforcement methodology for decades. Geyer's systematic approach to evidence collection, witness interviewing, and interjurisdictional cooperation provided a model for investigating complex crimes that crossed state boundaries and involved multiple victims. The trial and execution of H.H. Holmes marked the end of America's first encounter with systematic serial killing, but it also marked the beginning of a new era in criminal justice that would be shaped by the lessons learned from pursuing and prosecuting the nation's most sophisticated criminal. Holmes had pushed the boundaries of evil to their limits, and society had responded by expanding its capacity for justice to meet the challenge. As news of Holmes's execution spread across America through telegraph wires and newspaper headlines, citizens could finally rest assured that their most notorious criminal had faced the ultimate consequences of his crimes. But the questions Holmes had raised about human nature, criminal psychology, and the capacity for evil would continue to resonate long after his death. The devil had received his due, but his legacy would endure in the criminal justice procedures, investigative techniques, and psychological insights that his crimes had necessitated. America had confronted pure evil and emerged victorious, but the experience had revealed disturbing truths about human potential that would influence the nation's understanding of crime and justice for generations to come. Holmes was dead, but his influence on American criminal history had only just begun. The site of Holmes's murder castle at 63rd and Wallace Street in Chicago's Englewood neighborhood eventually became home to a United States post office, a building dedicated to communication and connection, standing where systematic murder had once flourished. Local residents occasionally reported strange sounds and unexplained phenomena, though skeptics attributed such stories to the power of suggestion rather than supernatural activity. Modern forensic experts continue to debate the true extent of Holmes's crimes, with victim estimates ranging from 9 proven murders to potentially over 200 deaths during his criminal career. The destruction of evidence and elimination of witnesses that characterized Holmes's methods make definitive accounting impossible, ensuring that the full scope of America's first systematic serial killer's activities may never be known. Holmes's techniques and innovations in systematic murder influenced criminal investigation procedures, insurance fraud detection methods, and architectural safety standards that remain relevant today. His case established legal precedents for prosecuting crimes that cross state boundaries and demonstrated the need for interagency cooperation in complex criminal investigations. The psychological profile that emerged from Holmes's crimes and trial contributed to early understanding of what would later be classified as psychopathic personality disorder, providing insights into criminal behavior that informed both law enforcement training and psychiatric research. Holmes's combination of high intelligence, complete lack of empathy, and sophisticated manipulation skills established a template for understanding criminal psychology that remains influential in modern forensic science. Perhaps most significantly, Holmes's crimes demonstrated that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most civilized, challenging Americans to recognize that evil could hide behind masks of respectability, education, and charm. This lesson would prove prophetic as the nation encountered future criminals who followed Holmes' example of systematic murder concealed behind facades of normalcy. The story of H.H. Holmes, America's first systematic serial killer, remains a dark chapter in the nation's criminal history, a reminder that the capacity for evil can flourish even in the heart of civilization's greatest achievements. His legacy serves as a permanent warning that vigilance against human predators must never cease, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, must never be denied. The murder castle may be gone, but the lessons it taught about human nature, criminal capability, and the price of civilized society's survival continue to resonate in every police investigation, every insurance claim review, and every stranger's charming smile that conceals unknown intentions. Evil had walked among Americans wearing a gentleman's face, and the nation would never again be quite so innocent about the monsters that might lurk behind respectable facades.